Meeting, City of Palo Alto, April 28th, 2015. Anyone from the public? I don't see any, but we are there. Please fill out a form, speaker form if you want to talk. Our first line of action is, roll call.
Keith Resdahl.
Here.
Pat Markovich. Here. Stacy Ashland. Here. Abby Knopper. Here. Deidre Cromie. Jennifer Hedderly. Here. Ed Mowing.
Here.
Eric Filsa.
Here. Okay, next is agenda changes, requests, deletions. Everyone have any modifications they want?
I do.
Okay.
On the,
Oh, this is for the agenda.
oh, I don't have agenda.
Okay. Oral communications, no one has filled out a speaker form, so you can skip over that. Approval of draft minutes from the special retreat. So we have two sets of minutes. This is from the special retreat. Jennifer, yours was from the retreat or from last week?
I have some on both.
Okay. Go ahead. Go ahead.
On page 4, line 63, where it says yes. Sorry, retreat minutes? Yes. Yeah. Page 4, line 163, where it says crosstalk. Let's just say we'll let you all know. Page 19, line 790. The last word out should be our department instead of out of pocket. Page 36, line 485, where it says crosstalk again, it should say, trying to keep abreast of council action on the issue. Then further down the same page, line 499, where it says crosstalk, should be monitoring council action. And then where it says inaudible at the end of that sentence, should be bad air already. And there were a lot of
Inaudible.
yeah.
Yeah, it was a bad take. She tried to do her best.
Yeah. Page 58, line 2413. It should be Loesch, L-O-S-C-H, not Loesch. Referring to Commissioner Loesch, former Commissioner Loesch. Same thing on line 2415. That's all.
Okay. Anyone else have, this is for, again, special meeting minutes. Go ahead.
I have one on page 22, line 907. That is even without El Camino, which is now instead of not being inaudible was open, which is now being opened to fund.
What line was that?
907?
Not being open? There's
It's now being open is what, that's what you're reading, it was not being inaudible. That's all.
Okay. Any retreat?
Yes.
Yes.
On page 5, line 169 and 170. Can we declare the revision complete and instead of the maintenance mode, it should say in maintenance mode, followed by a question mark, and then it is no longer actively being redesigned. Page 7, line 264, the end of the sentence, instead of that's an outreach base, it should say an outreach phase. Page 11, line 452, instead of we haven't done any community period, it should say we haven't done any community outreach period. That's it.
Okay, we are done with the minutes for the retreat. Now we move on to the minutes for the regular meeting. Okay, can I have a second? All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Good. So now we are looking at the minutes for the March 24th meeting. Are there any changes?
I have one.
Go for it.
On page 17, line 693. It says, it also came up with the teens the other day, it should be teens, as in teenagers, not teens.
Okay. Anyone else have notes? Okay. Do I have a motion to accept?
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay. Accept. We're now moving on to the study session for the Parks, Trails, Open Space, and Recreation Facilities Master Plan. Peter Jensen, go ahead.
Good evening, Commissioners. Thank you very much for coming earlier this evening. We do have a few things to get through tonight. I think that they're very poignant for our master planning project and connecting the data to the eventual recommendations that will be made. Tonight we are going to discuss the matrix that's set up, which is a tool that we put together to help cross-reference some of the data and to gather that in one location that's easier to reference back to. From the review that we've had over the last week, I feel that this tool is a good tool to use. It makes it a lot clearer for us to understand the analysis that has been done, the data has been collected, and then will definitely help in our next phase of prioritization. This tool, of course, is not the end or making any final recommendations at all. It basically is a tool to help us cross-reference that data to those recommendations that are going to be made, and then to eventually help us prioritize and make recommendations that are going into the master plan. We're going to go through that matrix. Of course, tonight we have our team from MIG here, the consultants, Lauren, Brian, and Ellie, who will be discussing different aspects of that matrix. And then there was some data that was given to you last week with your package. That is basically items for your binder, mostly analysis and data items that are centered around the matrix and pull information that have then been put into the matrix. So I'm hoping that you have a little bit of time to look at some of that stuff, because it will definitely come up in some of the conversations with the matrix itself. I think our goal here is to review the matrix, feel good about how it's going, and this line of thinking along to get to this summary of the data that will help us then prepare and propel us to the next phase, which is the prioritization and recommendation phase. So with that, I'll let Rob say a few words as well, and then we'll dive right into it.
Thank you, Peter. I just want to thank Peter for all the heavy lifting he's been doing in work. Sort of straggling two jobs here with Greg Betts gone, and sort of trying to put the department budget together and many other things and getting up to speed there. And so I've had to lean even more on Peter and Darren and some of the other staff. So I just want to thank them for that. But also the commission, you helped us actually create this matrix. So this isn't new, you helped design it. And what you'll see this evening, it is still sort of a work in progress, but this is an important meeting as we sort of work through the different elements of the matrix and start to look at the needs that have been identified by MIG and the rationale that they've gone through to define those needs, which is a really fascinating discussion that I've had a chance to look at the matrix over these last few days, and I definitely have some questions here and there, but I think the logic is really good and sound, so I'm looking forward to this evening's discussion. That's what I was going to say. So let's get into it and pass it on to MIG.
Great. I'm going to kick us off just briefly. Again, thank you for carving out some extra time for your evening to be here today to devote some resources to this effort. And as Rob and Peter mentioned, kind of our primary goal for the evening is to review and discuss the summary of needs that we put together in this matrix. And I think you folks saw the framework a couple months ago. It was kind of an empty shell, but our initial thinking on how do we, draw that connective thread from the data, whether it's demographic data or data from community survey or our other community outreach efforts. How do we, use that information to come up with what we're calling a summary of needs? And we think this is a tool that now that we've kind of gone through and combed through all of that information again that's in your binder and kind of pulled it up to the surface, that we think we have hopefully outlined a very linear and logical path to those summary of needs. We want to spend some time tonight getting you comfortable with the contents and the organization of the matrix. We have until about 8:30, and one of my jobs tonight is going to be to keep us moving and keep us on track as much as possible, because we do want to make sure that we devote time to each of the three elements as we've structured the matrix, so programs as well as recreation facilities, as well as parks, trails, and open space. One process point, Ryan does need to leave early tonight. He needs to leave at about 7:30, so if you see him leave the room, don't be alarmed. We knew that was going to happen. And then again, we want to talk not just about what the data tells us, but how that will be used when we get comfortable and start moving forward. Because the data is not equivalent to recommendations. It's not directive. It doesn't tell us what the plan will eventually say. It tells us what we've learned to date. So I want to draw your attention to one thing in your data and needs summary. On page 2 is a little graphic that I think outlines nicely kind of what the major phases of this effort are. And we are essentially now in the second bubble, the second of 2 bubbles, so about halfway through the process where we've kind of paused to regroup and outline the data and needs summary. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lauren, who will kind of give a bigger picture overview of how this all fits together and where we're going to go from here.
And so, as Ellie pointed out, we're really about halfway through, and you challenged us a couple months ago to say, whoa, look at this stack of information. How can we as a commission digest all of this and understand the way things are and what the needs are in this community so we can move forward and get behind recommendations. And I know the last time I was here, I really tried to temper expectations about how connected those threads could be. I actually was really, once we started doing it, I was surprised at how many threads we could find. And I think we talked about smoking guns and what are those, maybe focus on those, but we feel really good about where this ended up. But I want to point out that this is an important step right here in the middle. We have a lot of work ahead of us still and to do together with staff, with you, to develop the recommendations. Once we understand the needs, it's really getting our heads around what do we want to do about them and what are the highest priorities moving forward. So this is a very, very critical step tonight, and we're really eager to hear your thoughts. Now we're going to start with Ryan kind of reorienting you to the matrix, which we are now going to reveal and then we can start digging in. And as Ellie mentioned, we want to try to at least broadly hit on each section tonight and know that we can go as fast or slow as you want. This is really critical for you.
Can we either do a sharing method or we have a copy to have your own. If you want your own, you can have your own.
And you'll take one with you.
We'll share for now and then we'll take one.
Yeah.
maybe move over the material to the end of the table, that way you have.
Yeah, this actually, Peter's bringing this out.
I would say though, at the end of the night though, everyone should take one of these. So I'm gonna keep the extra ones, and then if you want one, right now you can have one. If not, at the end of the meeting, make sure that you take one home. We printed it out bigger, so it's easier to read and look at, but it is still definitely a large matrix to look at. That's why we're not looking at it directly on the screen.
It's actually, that's it, it's the PDF there, that's it. So if you just scroll down just a little bit.
So we're gonna, we probably just overwhelmed you with what we put in front of you, which is totally understandable. We wanted to have Ryan kind of walk through what the structure of this was, and then to hit some of the highlights that jumped out to us as we analyzed it. And then to kind of walk you through again, kind of what that logical step-by-step process was in developing it, and then talk about the summary of needs in a couple of instances. We obviously won't be able to get to every cell and every line, and that's not our goal. But we do want you to get comfortable with what the contents are, where they came from, and how it's being used.
So the file, the updated file that you all got no longer says concept, and I appreciate that, and it was asked of me by a couple of the commissioners that being able to understand where the changes were would be a helpful thing. I could definitely, we could pass along a redlined copy of that if that's useful to you, and we'll try to make sure that it's clearer as we're intending to update and replace pieces in your binder. So this one is a replacement. The earlier one was really a proof of concept kind of document so that we could show you what we were thinking. And this one is what we actually used as we were filling the document. And so if you remember, the first part of this hasn't changed dramatically. We talked a little bit about the process, and this goes through and explains the elements, which are the three largest divisions of the overall system. And you'll see those divided on the matrix there, the top one being parks, trails, and open space, the middle one being recreation facilities, and the bottom one being programming. So we're calling those elements, mostly to keep them straight. It's not necessarily a scientific term, it's more a useful term for us to differentiate between those and the one more level of detail that we felt was appropriate for this system-wide master planning effort, and those we are calling components. And so each of the rows essentially is a component as you talk about the different pieces of the overall puzzle that we have assembled here. And I want to emphasize one other thing up front as we're looking at this and getting oriented to it, is that one of the things that we heard across the process from you, from staff, from the community as a whole, is that the focus here should really be primarily on local needs. That this is really about the planning, that we understand that we are part of a region, that we have connections to that region, but that we are planning essentially for the park system in Palo Alto. And so there are any number of these things that if we were to decide, well, we're going to serve a larger audience than just the residents of Palo Alto intentionally, then that really does change the change some of the end of the day picture here. But just to run you through really quick again, the rows, as I said, are the components broken down between each of the elements. And across the column headings here are a whole series of topics, essentially, that are tied to data points and data sources, which are listed there in the second row. And each of those references, as well as the individual references that are listed within cells, are all keyed to your overall binder. And so the front of your binder has a document that's just a couple of pages that has the sources that are in there, and it describes which document is which. So when we say document 5, this is what the full title of it is. And so we'll try to stay consistent with that, because we really want, between this matrix and this binder, and one additional source, to really be able to pin back, okay, where did we hear this information? How do we backtrack it through the levels of summarization? Really giving us the opportunity, as Lauren said, you challenged us to make sure that we could show our work. And this is what we're trying to do here, is give you guys access to the highest level of summary in this matrix, the main level of summarization and analysis, which is the information that's represented in your binder, as well as one more level of detail for those who are really interested. We've also provided the raw data in a number of cases, whether it is an appendix that is, detailing on the project website now. There are at least 2 of the main sources of kind of raw data that were essentially more paper than we would have ever wanted to produce for each of you for the binders, but things like the program data export that we used, that we summarized up and analyzed in the summaries that you've been provided. And so that raw data is also available. Raw data behind the survey open-ended results, I believe, was available, and the one final piece was additional appendices on the demographic report, which included the school district's latest update of their demographics overall. So the entire report behind that, which is another 40 pages or so, providing you the opportunity, if you really want to dig down through our sources, those were some key ones that we wanted to make sure were available. So for each of these columns, what we're essentially doing is trying to provide you the bite of information, the kind of most relevant piece of information or a rating scale that gives us a sense of how intense this particular element or component rated in terms of those topic areas, the level of control, geographic distribution, et cetera. And for each of those columns, there is a set of rating criteria in this document. And I want to point you to those because there's a lot of, we had a lot of discussion when we presented this concept about the high, medium, and low as a scale, the kind of below, at, over. What do these mean in the context of this matrix? And each of those is described. And we tried as best we could, where the information existed, to tie those to data points that we could use the natural breaks in that data to really show, well, why did we say this was high versus medium? Or why did we say this was medium versus low? And so each of those places where we have those criteria, for example, column F, which is capacity and bookings, when we started digging into the program data, one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we understood, where we had that real hard number kind of information, was where are we saying that we are below, at, or over capacity? And so each one of those corresponds to, in the program analysis part 2, and you'll see references to that throughout that section of the matrix, the tables that summarize the program data by program area and really looking at, do we have classes that are not meeting minimums? Are we over a third of the classes that we're offering not meeting the minimum enrollments? Which was one of the critical data thresholds that the staff has been using to evaluate that program data, and also looking at the classes that were indicated as full or waitlisted as the other side of that criteria. And so we're using a mix of those and hard cutoffs. So if it was 34%, then it falls into the next category. We're really trying to keep it at that point, but those are not arbitrary numbers. Where we used those specific kinds of numbers, we really used the data to tell us where should these cutoffs be, where do these make sense based on what we're seeing overall, so that we can divide these into meaningful categories. And that's really that's one of the things I really wanted to point out. In some cases, because the data varied by element, we would also have a couple of different kind of criteria that would float into there depending on where we were at, but we tried to keep it as clear and simple as we could to define these. And the final piece on that overall orientation is that I want to emphasize that high, medium, and low does not mean, good, okay, and bad. This is high, medium, and low as defined in these criteria, where we're really talking about things like probably the most important one to look at, because it kind of pops out visually as you're reading across this, is the second to the last column, which is projected demand. It's column K. And so these tend to have a high, medium, and low with no sources. This column is largely about our professional judgment and our tracking of what's going on. We talked that there would be some of that going on in this, and it's an important part of this overall process. But high, medium, and low here does not mean that this is a high need or a medium need or a low need. What this means is exactly what it says here, is that high means that there's a lot of opportunity in the future to see new user groups or populations, to expand those services, to expand that area. Whereas medium is there's some opportunity, some new user groups, And low was really that we didn't see much opportunity to serve new user groups. So this is not saying if there is a low projected demand that you should stop doing this right now. We're not making those value judgments at this state. What we're saying is line by line, do we see in the future opportunity to grow this area? And so that one's a good example of both how the high, medium, and low works, as well as how we want this information to be read at this stage. We're really looking at the needs overall.
It's not a question.
Go ahead.
So by opportunities to grow, this is really more about projected opportunities to grow as opposed to demand. It's not related to demand at all. Or are you talking about capacity of the system to add on in that area?
No, this is
Are you
really-
talking about expected changes in user groups that will make the demand greater in the future?
Yes, the
Yes,
latter,
the latter.
yes.
So stay with
Say that again.
Yeah, say that.
So
Exactly.
the projected demand column is about the changes in the overall environment, the way that things are going, that will increase, that we see the potential to increase the overall user base if additional opportunities were offered, essentially, as it evolves. So I think that, sorry, I'm tripping over that, but overall, the concept is that there is going to be in the future an opportunity you could serve more people with more activities in this area.
So you're not saying you expect a greater demand in these areas that have an H there in the future? We expect.
Yeah, yes, we are. Yeah, yes, we are, because there's either a recreation trend that's happening, or there's a population segment
So the
that's
first cut
happening.
is an expectation of greater demand.
Yep,
Would get a high. And then if there are also opportunities to expand usage of that particular.
Well, there's also the capacity column, which is essentially addressing, I think, the first part of your point there, which is that is there room within the system as it exists today
Okay,
to,
so this column K is only about demand.
Yes.
It's not about capacity to grow.
yes.
So let me see if I can try. What you're saying is that if it's high, that means you see a lot of potential for demand in the future. If it's low, you don't see potential for a lot more demand than there is today, but that doesn't mean you should stop doing it because it might be fully utilized today.
Yes, yes. And did that get to clarity?
But it is demand, because when you were talking originally, you talked about all these opportunities, and my brain was saying, why do we care about the opportunities if there's not much demand?
It is demand. It is demand looking forward. It's not a realized demand at this point. And really this column was intended to capture some of the items that, because we aren't offering them now, or we aren't offering them at a scale, is there, we need to be able to look beyond what we have the data for, because if we only look at the things, and I think that your chair pointed this out, if we only look at the things that we can measure right now, how are we ever going to know what the next thing is? How are we ever going to know how to look beyond that? So it is a demand, but it's a prospective demand.
Okay, and on the same point, if I can follow there. So I didn't quite get how you said it was kind of quantified. It was a cutoff between low, medium, and high based on.
On this one, there is not. On this one is pretty much purely a professional judgment call. On other columns, there are specific quantifications, such as the capacity one, talking about the program data. If you look at column F, where below capacity would equal 33% of the classes in that area are not meeting their minimum enrollment, which means, according to the overall structure of pricing and enrollment setting, they're not meeting their cost recovery goals.
So when you get over to the the G column, the first one is walkability, and that's H, and the next one's M. You're saying that is quantitative?
There are some parts of that, in column G, there are some parts of that we were looking specifically at the quantitative data that was provided in the MAPIDA input. So when we were looking at the kind of overall quality of parks, we were using the scores that people gave for those parks overall, but there's also an element of that is about the number of times that it was referenced in terms of it was not if there were deficiencies noted over and over again in the process, it was working its way down that rating.
So in your data needs summary, beginning on page 5, with the descriptions of the criteria, and wherever possible, based on the available information and data, we set some quantitative boundaries to those, or parameters for high, medium, and low. That will be possible for every single element and every single component. And then when you get to column K, it's kind of our roll-up of all of the things that came before, overlaid with our professional judgment to come up with the high, medium, low. And then the next column is kind of the narrative summary, providing a little more detail on what that means.
What we feel the need overall is stated at. And so that's ultimately kind of the final column there is ultimately kind of the summation of how we read these data points, where that thread led us as we worked through the information. And so one of the things, yeah.
I have a question. When you're measuring demand, go back on column K, you're measuring this in users. You're not measuring this in dollars or demand for money to require to maintain. For example, when Rob and I were walking through this earlier, the special buildings in the parks, Lucy Evans, I'm thinking of down in Baylands, that's not as usable as we would like it. And there's a big public demand to bring that back to what it used to be. So even though we wouldn't be adding facilities, it would take a significant amount of money to bring that up to what the community wants it to be. So when you're talking about demand in that case, are you talking about demand for money to be allocated to these roads? Or is it just the gross number of people that are going to be going in? And
This is definitely the people side, looking at what do people want to do. The next step in terms of criteria and prioritization is where we start to bring in decision-making criteria, like what is the capital cost, what is the long-term operating cost, and you are going to help us set criteria because you may have different financial criteria for different
so I just want to clarify that this is just users, that has nothing to do with
Yes.
money or anything like that.
Yes.
Okay.
Those other criteria is the next layer of information that we would be adding over top of this.
It would be useful for me if you would walk through some of these columns,
Yep.
and some of these columns aren't clear exactly what they're measuring.
Okay, and
Well, one of the things that we are planning on doing is actually walking across on these shaded ones. I think they're really illustrative, and I guess a process question for you is, do you want some time to just sit back and soak this in for a couple minutes before we start in on that, or are you ready to dive in?
I think the specific of examples as you're asking about.
great. And so I'm going to follow along on my own copy here because I want to be able to read it a little bit. But one of the places that we wanted to start overall was a message that you've heard us talk about as we've gone through different analyses, different summaries, and is the first of the rows that is highlighted in your matrix. It's row 11, and it's experience nature as a component of the overall system. And so what I want to do is I'm going to walk you through across the columns here with one or so examples of each of the pieces, but we're going to walk through this experience nature one as a starting point to kind of explain where we're at and where our thinking is. And so the first column, the first couple of columns are just identifying. You've got the component name. As you get to column C, what we're trying to identify is what's in the inventory. Let's just get strictly the facts. What's the what's the kind of volume of what's in our system currently. The next column is level of control. What we're measuring here is really how much authority or ability does the city have to change things or to influence how things will change on that site. And so there's two big factors in this that we use primarily based on the information we had available. I'm going to stop repeating that over and over again because I'm going to just make that a blanket statement. All of this is based on the information we had available. We're happy to hear about other sources you think might be relevant, but level of control is primarily based on two major factors. One is ownership of property, whether or not the city owns that property or has control through a contractual obligation. And the other is that we wanted to acknowledge and recognize was sea level rise, because there are changes that will be beyond our control at some of our sites as a result of sea level rise. It's a relatively small part of the overall sites, but it was something that was definitely a part of our analysis. So a high level of control would indicate that the city can basically choose what it is that we want to do. There are, of course, policy and legal limits and everything to that, but overall, we can decide we want to have programming, this is what it's going to be. The next column, E, is the geographic analysis. And what this is really looking at is the spread of features across the city. We did a couple of different ways of looking at that. We did, you'll see source 9 listed here, and source 9, if you go back to your handy dandy reference at the front of your binders, is the site-by-site analysis and existing conditions maps. And so we've got a map in your binder for each of the individual sites. We've also done, as you all know, a set of maps that are referenced in other places that are about the geographic analysis, kind of breakdown of how far different parts of the system are from the average residents across the city. And so that's another piece that falls into that geographic analysis column. Capacity and bookings for this item is not available. It really is. We know that ultimately there probably is some capacity, but we have no way to measure it. And so there's an NA in this column for experienced nature. You'll see as we get down into some of the more measurables that is an important column. The next column is perception of quality. So we did not make a decision about absolute quality. We aren't going to make that judgment. What we are measuring here is what people told us about how they see the quality of these sites. And in this case, we have a mixed, the medium is a mixed result essentially. And one of the things that was that is referenced here specifically, where we tried to reference things was where we heard something that really felt like it pointed in the direction. It's not necessarily the be-all and end-all of our decision, but it was something that was the most clear kind of point on it. And in this case, it was source 13, which is the workshop summary. We heard a lot of things kind of back and forth about the desire, as well as the kind of the mixed availability and opportunity to experience nature in the park system, especially outside of the preserves. Looking at express need, again, this actually goes back to some of the same sources. And, 13 was the workshop summary. So in express need, what we're talking about here is not how good it is, but how much do we need it? How much do we need more of it? And the criteria there were set up around, are we hearing this message? Are we hearing that we need more of this particular component in the system across multiple modes of input, across multiple different forms of communicating with the community? And so
express need relative to the current capacity.
Yes, basically, we love it and we want it to stay. It's we want more of it. We want more. We need more opportunities. Dog parks is a great example of this. We heard over and over again in different forums across the community. We need more. We need more. We need more of something. And so here we're referencing particularly the survey, and I believe the I have my list in front of me, but the 16 is. Everybody's suffering from too much paper. I understand that completely. Stakeholder summaries. Okay. And so, continuing on then, that's an important column. That's one that draws in survey results, it draws in mapping results, it draws in the individual interviews that we held with folks, which are summarized in one of the documents you were provided today as part of your update. And then the next column, column I, is about demographic trends. This is really about how we see the trends impacting the overall demand. So thinking about is there, based on population growth, based on shifts in the way that people are using parks and recreation across the country, is there a way to, can we see an expectation that demand will be growing as a result of those trends? Or is it going to be basically stable, or is it going to be in decline? And overall, because of population growth, we're really seeing most things either be in a stable situation, essentially growing with population growth, or overall in a growth mode. There really weren't any that we were identifying that were really in decline. And I think that what you're seeing there ultimately is that those things that have been in decline are essentially getting squeezed out of the system in the first place. It's kind of a natural selection process.
Okay, so if we look at the column I
Mhm.
on this experience nature one, we're citing source 7 that we have growth. Why, for example, can you explain why we got growth for that one and maybe on line 6, we're stable for play for children?
The overall, I would say that the push and if you open your binders and look at, source 7 is going to be the primary source for this because that's our document on demographic trends, or demographics and trends. But in that document on pages 10 to 11, we describe the overall trend, which is a very large push nationwide right now to increase the access to nature for youth and families and adults and everybody else because of disconnection. And there's a very strong push in that is beyond just a growth with population kind of change. So I would say that play for children as an access point is going to grow as the population of children grows, which is fairly stable based on the school age demographics and everything else. But we're seeing an increase in the push so more of those kids and more of those adults are going to be involved in experiencing nature as a result of this overall push across the country right now.
So in this, on page 10, we're talking about this core plan. They're saying they're spending more and more time with electronic media, and they shouldn't be, but they should be playing more with nature. Are you saying that they should be playing? Is that how you get the growth here, or that we actually have seen that children?
We are seeing a trend shift. We are seeing we are seeing the upward swing of that, but we are also expecting a greater upward swing overall. It is again a little bit perspective, but overall we are both seeing it and expecting a larger shift towards this. Because of, much like we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years in the obesity epidemic, we could have said 5 or 10 years ago everybody's getting fatter. But the reality is that by concerted effort, by national attention, we have actually stabilized that trend and shifted that in terms of childhood obesity in a lot of places. So I think that it's a very similar and a parallel kind of reasoning there.
When I look at the data, it doesn't seem to support the conclusion. Conclusion certainly, from an anecdotal standpoint, could well be true. It's just the data that you're citing doesn't seem to support the claim.
Okay. Well, I think that's part of the pushback that we're totally open to here, Keith. I want to make sure that you don't take this as the honest gospel truth here. What we're trying to do, we are trying to interpret data, and we're trying to summarize it at a level that will work.
And I'm not saying that you should change your conclusion. What I'm saying is, in this section, I would want some explanation why you would expect growth. And so if you added a paragraph in here saying, we expect more growth because of X, Y, Z, I think that would back up your statement in the matrix.
Okay.
That's the point I'm getting.
I appreciate that. I do. And it's a good point. I think that we do want those connections to be visible.
I do think one other, there's also a lot of this external research that industry research about, what do different age segments want to do, and, things like bird watching, hiking, you're seeing that increasing rapidly in the older adult population, which also happens to be a population that is increasing rapidly here, and that's also one of the other factors in that. That is one of the other factors there. Bird watching is an activity when you look at national participation data and California specific participation data, it's gone like that, and it's really tracked with the population. Now, at some point it's going to plateau because unless you're building new bird watchers or whatever, but trying to be attuned to some of those things that happen in more of a natural setting, and so some of that tracks with your population segments that are projected to grow most rapidly. And I think the two that you brought up, the play for children, more stable because your child population is more stable. Older adults, the trajectory seems to be more like that. So in addition to the push for more natural experiences for kids, there's just this sort of overall potential growth in those types of activities. that may be, better suited to the column K, so we can discuss that.
So then, just to round out the discussion of these particular, this particular row here, I want to point out the barriers to participation. In most of the top element here, in the Parks and Recreation element, the barriers to participation are really about access. They're really about, do we have the places to experience this near the people who are living there? And in this case, we cite source 10, which are those geographic analysis maps. And the map that we specifically call out on that, I just want to point out, we're actually reading it a little bit in inverse. It's the map that shows where the opportunities to experience, kind of the relax and enjoy the outdoor environment. But one of the things that we noted in reading those maps overall is really that, again, the point made on the geographic analysis here, where the most of the opportunities to experience nature, we saw this in our site-by-site evaluation as well, exist around that periphery and are difficult to access on foot or by bike. There are barriers to people just getting there. And so, so that's the column J. And then column K, as I said, is a little bit of summary, a little bit of professional judgment. As Lauren's saying, there's definitely the two big demographic segments of the youth and the elderly or the active adults, really seeing growth in, potential for growth in that area. There's a lot of audience that could be served that is not yet being served. And our summary overall of the need for that area then reflects that. It's really talking about needing additional spaces to relax and enjoy the outdoors. The sighting is critical. There's some, oh wait, I'm looking at the wrong one, sorry. That's the, hang on, off the line. The integration of natural processes and features in parks and the potential to support this. So parks with creek frontage are an interesting opportunity. As explored in the visual preference survey across the workshops, the opportunity to integrate natural features and experiences into the more urban parks was something that is an express need as well as a need that we think is borne out by the overall data set. And so
one comment that I get, there's a park in Los Angeles, called Shoe Park, where there's a creek going through, where the kids can actually go down and play in the creek.
Touch the creek, yeah.
And I've had a lot of people comment saying, I wish Palo Alto had something like that.
Yeah.
Now, unfortunately, most of the creeks in Palo Alto are concrete, so it makes it much harder, but I would concur that there seems to be demand.
And so this is, yeah, please.
Question on,
Full park has creek access.
clarification on this column J.
That's great. It's not noticeable. That's deep.
I'm just trying to stay with a specific example so we can understand conceptually what you're doing. So you've got J as being high, and your reference there was because the nature areas that I presume that means that you identified in C are on the outer rim of the city.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask the quantitative question again. There's some sort of mileage number that you have in there? And let me say why I ask that, because you've taken out 30 parks for this description, so because you want to be natural, totally natural, not parks. So you've taken out most of the inventory of the city, and then you say it's difficult access to get to. On the other hand, if somebody really wants to get into nature, then maybe a 10-minute drive to get to Foothills Park is not so tough. So I was trying to figure out how you're making these quantifications here.
I think that in terms of the first part of your question, in terms of there being a specific mileage, no. What we were running up against, what we were analyzing based on is really how people were responding to, I mean, there were a variety of points here. People saying that, well, we know that this stuff exists out there, but we're not able to get to it. Or, so there's an assimilation of a variety of points that are feeding into that. But I think that the second point really of how do we define what that experience of nature looks like? Why do we rule out 30 parks? Is a very valid one and is a difficult one to pin down specifically. We heard overall that the people of Palo Alto do not believe that their typical park experience in the city parks kind of represents that natural experience. And so
as observers, so the reason that first column, says, okay, you can experience nature at 4 park sites as well as the preserves, is really about, is it a manicured setting? Your parks are lovely, but mostly every piece of ground has been developed as a landscape.
Yeah.
And so there are a few parks where there is an opportunity where it's more of what was there before, and it's more of a wild scape, and it might be a
I think we get
little.
the differences, and I think that's a fair
Yeah.
statement, but I'm just saying, how hard is it to do a 10-minute drive to get to nature? Because I look at it the other way, eventually this goes to council, and they say, well, one of the things that our citizens want to do most is experience nature. And the source says, man, that's really hard to do, so we have to now put in some more.
Well,
Why don't we do that in the city center?
Well, here's
It's
the
kind of it's a moot point.
But here's the thing, is that this is this is where we're getting to on the priority setting, so you can decide how to respond to that. You can say, you know what we've heard from the community is it's really most important to get out in real nature. And it might take a little longer, but you can have, a couple-hour experience, and it's a great experience, and that's okay. You might decide, based on what we've heard, we want to reintegrate, as we suggested as a need, some natural spaces into appropriate developed parks so people have something a little closer to home. And there could be a big expense if you wanted to monkey around with the creek, but there could also be some benefit.
Yeah.
And so the point here is to try to give you some data points on which you can make those decisions as we develop criteria together, and some of those are going to be cost benefit and what the return on investment is. And you bring up exactly the crux of the problem and the crux of what we need to do next together.
What are the 4 sites that
So if I remember correctly, I have a file that specifies, and I believe that what we came down to were El Palo Alto Park, which, while small, is a much more natural experience. There were, I'm trying to remember, it's the
Probably Gold Park.
yeah, I think that it was a mix of the inventory and the individual site analyses, and I believe that I have this list, and I'm trying to remember what they are off the top of my head, and I don't remember them off the top of my head, but there were basically 4 sites that were called out as a result of our site visits and our and the inventory work that basically were highlighted there.
So when you're saying it's the existing condition maps and all the maps are here, so there's no indication on the binder of what 4 sites you're referring to?
That is a real possibility, actually. The reference, I know that we had made references to specific ones in specific, the existing condition maps, and that's not referenced, which is a good point. And I think that getting those numbers, especially where it's not like all of the preserves or all of the parks, getting those numbers clarified would be a good clarification for us. We've got that backup. We thought we were referencing something that may have been more in our collective minds than on paper.
What I found helpful is I looked through the matrix and tried to sort of understand the thinking and the conclusions in particular was to take out this report, the data needs summary report, and keep reminding myself what, when it says, when we were looking at barriers to participation, how is that defined? And then reread that, and then go back and look at this, and then look at the data, and then I was able to make the connection a little easier. So there's a couple of questions there about, a number of these headings, and, these are just headings when they're described, and what does high really mean, what does low, medium really mean in this context is helpful because there's so many data sources. It's helpful to be reminded of having this with you as you go. That's what I found helpful.
So 2 points. One, we just want to reiterate that this is working draft, so this is an evolving document. We're going to refine it based on what we hear tonight. We're going to refine it based on questions you come back to us with, so don't think this is a static, be-all, end-all document by any means, so please give us those questions. The other point is on the time and process front, we've got about 10 more minutes before I want to shift to the programs element, particularly while we still have Ryan here. So would it be helpful to walk through another example that we highlighted in this section. Was that a useful exercise?
I think that was.
Okay, great.
Another road.
Sure, sure. I'll do this one a little bit quicker. We've got a few of the questions starting to sort out a little bit here as we go, but let's go down to row 14.
I think we need to change the tape.
Oh, okay. We'll pause for a moment while we change the tape.
Okay, moving on.
We are back. Okay, so we're on. So I'm gonna zip through real quick one that I know is near and dear to everyone's heart, which is the availability of restrooms, which is row 14. This one was particularly called out because it is an absolutely essential function of parks in some settings. I'm not trying to make a value judgment that you should have a restroom in every single park in every single place in the community, but that is the component that more people comment on, that more people note in terms of quality, in terms of everything else. It is high in people's minds in terms of park usage. And so working across here, inventory, this one is a little bit more explicit. It's called straight out in the inventory, where they exist, where they do not. The level of control, these are all in sites pretty much that the city owns. We can decide whether or not there are restrooms in those sites. There are, of course, caveats to that. The geographic analysis, this one, while we did not run a map-based analysis of it, we definitely made an observation here essentially that what we heard overall was that there was a dissatisfaction with the availability of restrooms across the system. The capacity in both observation of the site as well as overall from the input, we were really saying is that the existing facilities are over their capacity to support the overall system. That is not necessarily true at individual levels, but thinking about the system as a whole here, we felt that it was. Perception of quality overall, this was something that...
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay, so over means we have more capacity than need.
No, over is over capacity. Essentially, there's not enough capacity to support the need.
But if you go down to community gardens, which is 4 lines lower, we have a big wait list on community gardens, and there you say below.
We actually don't have a wait list on community gardens anymore. No, this year there are available community garden plots currently, according to the data that we were given a month ago. We were talking with the gardeners, and it's partly about they've cut down the size of plots, and but it's also about that was a functional decision, not a capacity decision, and that the demand has fluctuated a bit, but currently we are actually below the overall capacity.
So over means that we have a shortage.
Yes.
And at the top of the column it says capacity divided by bookings.
There's no.
No, it's capacity or bookings, and that should be, I would say that it's because we don't have bookings data specifically for all points, we wanted to talk about capacity or bookings.
It'd be nice if there was a key up there that said over means shortage or something like that, because it's not obvious to me that over means that we have a shortage.
I agree that it's a little awkward language-wise. I think that we can try to clarify that. Maybe choose some different language.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead.
The perception of quality overall. These were out of double checking my guess here. Out of the intercepts, the availability as well as the overall quality of the facilities we were seeing, people often comment on these as low quality. And so I don't think that is an absolute statement as much as it is probably, because of the sources of this information, it is probably commenting more again on the availability of the facility than the actual cleanliness of it on any given day, although people want to comment on that as well. I want to just point that out. Express need, this is one where we have not only multiple sources listed, but I would say that in our previous conversations about this matrix and trying to identify things data points that really do feel like kind of a smoking gun, we have a survey result specifically about the desire for restrooms that's cited here that is really citywide. It was listed as one of the restrooms at basically all sites it was one of the highest supported features to overall support the usage of parks. And so we have a very strong result there, as well as supporting results from multiple inputs. And so really that high, again, is we heard a consistent message across lots of different input points. Demographic trends, oh, sorry, please.
So that's one in particular that I think is, if you drill down further, you might come to a different conclusion, because I think, well, overall, across the whole system, there's high demand with high expressed need for bathrooms. On a site-by-site basis, there's very mixed and inconsistent opinion about whether any particular park should have a bathroom or not.
But
So that kind of detail might be helpful to capture in some way.
But I think we can get some of that possibly through MAPIDA, but I think what it gives you a counterpoint to is when you do a site-specific master plan, the folks who tend to come out are gonna live right nearby, and they're gonna have their own particular opinions based on, well, I live right next door. And so it's really hard to capture, is there a need or not? And I think this helps give you a picture of where that priority is across the city, and might help you, set policy based on, a level of park use, or, we want to do this, we don't want to do this, here's when we do. That might help you go into design processes later on with some, better foundation and grounding.
And the demographic trends for this, we decided ultimately we were not going to make a statement about demographic trends because it felt as though it was a universal point, pretty much changes with demographic or with population. The barriers to participation, again, ultimately this is, most of these lines reference back to the overall availability, and I would say that's a little bit of because of the type of facility that we're talking about here, the type of amenity that we're talking about here, it's a little bit less differentiated in terms of the way that those points play out. We definitely have, as I've said here, more times where we're citing the availability of the restroom is the issue. But overall, I think that this one as a whole rests largely on where they are distributed and the overall expressed need across multiple needs or multiple inputs.
I'm still a little confused about the barriers of participation for public bathrooms.
Well, if it is not,
Is this reflect the current design, or is this inherent to public bathrooms?
I would say that barriers to participation across the board is reflective of the current situation.
How many bathrooms are available in the apartment?
Are they where we want them to be?
But isn't that
So if they're
capacity as opposed to barrier to participation?
If
Look at it that way too, they both talk to one another. I think that in this case, if there's a park and it doesn't have a bathroom, it's a big barrier.
Yep.
And there's a lot of parks that have bathrooms, so therefore the barrier is
What- yeah.
considered high. I think that's what.
Yeah, I think that's generally the thinking here. The one other thing that I would add, which isn't cited specifically here, but it actually creates a barrier to participation in other things. For example, the sports users made a very big point of it is almost impossible for them to use a park that has no restroom, because they're going to be on site with a whole bunch of very small children for an extended period of time, and so it really does create a barrier to using that site. I've also personal experience as well as a lot of anecdotes about the barrier that it presents for parents of very small children in general to go to even use their neighborhood park without a restroom available. So I think that that's not really how we intended that category to be applied globally, but it is something that relates specifically to this element or this component. And so overall, we see that projected demand, there's a lot of potential to serve a larger set of the population. And ultimately, the summary of our need there, the restrooms at more sites potentially provided as a standard feature at Palo Alto parks. And I know that is potentially a controversial statement, but I think that we want to emphasize again that this is not the recommendation. We think that the need is, based on everything that we've heard, that it probably should be considered as a standard feature. So that's where we came out with summary on that point. And I guess we're a little bit over our time or our desired time to make sure that we get into the programs, but I do want to make sure that any other final comments got captured here?
I'm sorry I came late. I just wanted to capture a comment. When we talk, I know that people really want more experience of nature in parks, and so the comment that I have is, I think by putting in sort of an artificial creek in a park is, in my view, meets that less well than preserving a natural area in a park. I just wanted to make that comment.
Okay. So it's a lower quality, obviously, of experience. It could even be detrimental in some situations where it's not related.
Right, and I would just put an emphasis on conservation and protection of what we have. I think feeds that desire more adequately.
So, yeah, please.
Okay, one more clarification question about barriers. You're not talking physical barriers, you're talking barriers such as there's insufficient, capacity is capacity. Is it redundant to that, or are you talking about when we're high barriers for swimming pools, for example? Does that mean
I would say
safety
that I think that's an interesting point and a good point to focus on, because I would say the difference between capacity and barriers there is the capacity would be, I got to the pool and I couldn't get in because they had no more room in that pool for me to swim, or they had no more lifeguards or whatever. A barrier would be, I cannot get to that pool because it's on the other side of town and I don't have transportation.
Okay.
Or it costs too much.
Or it costs too much, or, yeah, and so they are related, of course, but I think they are worth considering separate if possible, so.
And I think as Rob pointed out, definitely refer back to the criteria, because the barriers to access and participation say these could include cost, location, physical accessibility, so around particular park sites, we heard feedback from people around that. For transportation availability, in case of specific facilities, maybe less so with your system than with some places where, our recreation centers are open from 9 to 3, Monday through Friday. Isn't that convenient? That could be a barrier. And so here, this is reported, and it's a lot of different sources. So in using MAPITA, people could actually report specific, barriers to movement, and in some cases, those are what's cited. In other cases, at public meetings, people talked about, physical accessibility or perceived cost or transportation barrier, and so the sources are pretty important there because it's a real mixed bag, because there's a lot of different types of barriers.
Thank you.
I guess I'm still trying to wrap my brain around this. On one hand, if you have, let's say, something like golf that takes a long time to learn and it's expensive, that would be a barrier to participation. And so even though we might look at it and say, say we're considering expanding the golf course, you'd say, is this something that we should spend our money on? And then say, well, there's barriers to participation, that the people in the city who don't know how to play golf, it'll be hard for them to take advantage of this. So it makes it less attractive for us to build.
I would clarify that I don't think that the length of time to learn, the cost could be a barrier, and I think that you might address that in either programmatic or budgetary decisions about that course. But in terms of deciding if you were, I understand the thought exercise. I'm having a hard time jumping back to where would we put another golf course, or an expanded golf course. But I think that the barriers would be an influencing factor to how or why you would enhance.
So in the way that barriers are defined here, though, the fact that it takes a long time or you need a lot of equipment, that's really not factored in. The fact that your golf course is on one side of town and you have to go across a number of streets to get there, it may be that somebody cited particular barriers along the way. We couldn't really measure people's opinion on every single activity, like is it too much of a barrier for you to learn how to play golf? That's really a programmatic decision of the golf course operator about how to encourage play, but we're not talking about barriers in that particular way.
So when I see a high barrier, does that mean it's more attractive to add that facility or less attractive to add that facility?
It's not a one-to-one. I think that's what I'm saying.
And in some cases, it's difficult to get to certain facilities. In the case of, if you jump up to line 9, the activity access gathering together, there's low barriers to participation because you provide it in a lot of places. There's a lot of places throughout the city to do that. People didn't report that they had a hard time going someplace to do that activity. So that got it low. Whereas you have fewer facilities or their location is something that people reported as problematic in getting to, or that there is, the facilities don't exist. I mean, according to Darren, his staff sees the issue about not having restrooms at certain parks because if little kids have to go, their parents are sending them in the bushes. And so they either don't go to the park or...
But the barriers to participation, how am I going to use that in park planning?
You are going to use, so it's...
Because we already have a column over here that talks about capacity. So it's not, if you look at the restroom one, the fact that we don't have enough restrooms has already been reflected in column F. What does column J tell me that I don't already know?
Well, maybe restrooms would make sense to say NA because it's addressed enough in capacity. In terms of many of these columns, though, there's a lot of policy decisions that affect how people might take advantage of your system and the services that you're providing. And so I think that is where it's really going to help you as we get into the policies around fees and charges, where you locate facilities, where you do programming, where you encourage certain types of activities and where you allow bookings of certain types of activities. I think they will be an input that will help you think about how those policies play out.
I don't want to see it anymore, so let's move on to the recreation program.
Yeah, we're gonna jump down to programs, and part of that is accommodating me, and I appreciate your willingness to do that. We're gonna jump into that because I have a lot of the accumulated knowledge and thinking of this in my head, and I'm gonna have to depart in 15 minutes. So I wanted to give you guys an orientation to this. I want to emphasize 2 of the pieces that you received that went into your binders today that really play heavily in this one. The first one is part 2 of the recreation analysis. We heard very strongly from you all. You wanted to get more detail about how the current programming is rolling out. What are the stats showing? What is the data behind it? And this document, this part 2, which is meant to be kind of added behind the first part, which talked about generally what programs are offered by who, what kind of barriers might we be facing. This one is very specifically about the recreation registration data across the city of Palo Alto. So this one goes into each of the program areas that are listed here on the matrix, and there is a table that shows the number of classes, the number of participants, the participants per class, et cetera, number of classes that have wait lists. I want to emphasize that one because it is the number of classes that have wait lists, not the number of people on wait lists. So that is an important distinction because sometimes there's one extremely popular scenario where, for example, there's one swimming slot that obviously is the perfect swimming slot for the entire city of Palo Alto because there's like 400 people on the waiting list. But that was a total outlier in most cases. And so we counted them by the number of individual sessions that had wait lists, not by the number of people on that wait list.
Okay. So if you go to page 29, I don't understand how you get more than 100%.
Okay. Yes. No, that's a good point. So we used that as a little bit of a. We didn't use that in a hard sense, but basically using the data that we had, classes that were indicated as full could also have been indicated as having a wait list. That 100%. Or the final column was the percentage of classes that were indicated either as full or with a wait list. basically what we were doing intentionally was giving a little bit of a double count to the classes that had a wait list. So it's not meant to be, because it's 100% and the other one's 150%, that one's, you know, better than the other, but it was meant to acknowledge the fact that you have classes that fill and you have classes that have standing wait lists.
Do you have two columns and have percentage of classes full, percentage of classes with wait lists?
We can break that down. It's
I think that's cleaner than.
Does that relate back to the criteria that you said on page 22? Because I had a comment on the last criteria point, which is you have 4 bullets on page 22. Do you know what page I'm talking about? I think it relates to this over 100%. Is it this bullet point here?
Oh, yes.
I'd like to comment on that bullet point. Is this the time to do it?
Sure.
I think I agree with Commissioner Rectal. I think we are not well served by seeing something that's over 100% because it doesn't give us the granularity that we need to see. So
We do have the number of classes and the number of classes with waitlists listed separately. I actually kind of like to be double count because it stands out more that
It gave us a simple metric, and I agree that percentages over 100 make people antsy. I get that, I do, and maybe it's the fact that it's a percentage is.
We got extra credit.
Yeah, it's a little it skews it because you're naturally trained to not want it to add up to more than 100, but the intention there was definitely to give that extra emphasis, and
I guess as long as we have the raw data there, then it's not quite important.
yeah, the information that it's calculated on is presented right there. So if you're comfortable with that, I understand the comment. I guess I would prefer, in a lot of ways, I would prefer to not go back and rerun, 27 tables or whatever to break that out. I have the Excel sheet. I can do that fairly quickly. It's just getting it back into a document, getting it back out and distributed to you guys is a little bit more production than. That may or may not work.
I don't know about others. My personal opinion, as long as the raw data is there, then I guess it's okay. It's still, it's not as clear as I would like, but it's good.
Okay.
can I just ask about the bullet point on page 22 because I don't understand it.
Okay.
Okay, so it's your 4th bullet point. There's a group of 4 bullet points on page 22, and it's the 4th one in the group of 4.
Yes.
And you have percent of classes full or waitlisted. And then you give the criteria, you give how you calculate that, but it seems to me that you should be saying percent of classes full and waitlisted. I'm a little bit confused about the use of or there. Is it or and? Because they mean 2 different things.
Well, it's not and because there are classes that are full but not waitlisted. But it would be or because it would need to be inclusive but also allow for either option.
So, right, so some of them are both?
Some of them are both.
And some of them are not?
And some of them are both, some of them are just full, some of them are neither. There are none that are waitlisted without being full as far as I saw. That shouldn't happen unless it was a coding error. And so there's, but yes, there are some that are both and some that are not, and some that are one.
Okay, I personally found that confusing and I would
Okay.
like to see it parsed out, but again, maybe the whole commission needs to weigh in on it.
Okay. Well, so if we're all clear on why that is what it is, we can address, and I'm happy to field your comment. I understand where you're coming from, I really do. I don't want to hang up this conversation on that point for now.
While we're on that point, can I just ask another question about that same chart on page 20, well, just one of the charts on page 28, table 7 of day camps. You have number of full classes column, number of classes with a wait list, but for debate and freshman leadership and possibly some others, the number of full classes is smaller than the number of waitlist classes.
So you're proving me wrong there. No, that's an interesting point. I will look into that because, like I said, it could either be a coding error or it could be that they were for some reason creating waitlists intentionally for classes that were not indicated full. But I'll clarify that with program staff. So that is table 7. Can you just note that for me? Thank you. Sharp eyes.
Yeah, example on table 8 on the top of page 29 for basketball, if there's 12 classes, 4 are full 3 are waitlisted, and yet 0 are under the minimum. I'm just wondering how quick, it doesn't add up.
Okay, so that's a good clarifying point, thank you. There is a difference between meeting the minimum and being full. Does that make sense? So if
Can you
you,
walk through one of those lines and explain?
Sure.
Okay.
so basketball, if we're all on table 8 on page 29, basketball has 12 sessions offered. So that is, and the number of participants in that registered are 288, which makes the average participants per class 24. There were 0 classes canceled in that program area. So there's none of those 12 classes that were originally offered were canceled. So there's a 0% canceled out of the classes that were scheduled. There were none of those classes that were under the minimum and not canceled. So what that would mean is that we didn't meet our enrollment minimum, but we continued to offer it anyway. We were close, or we decided to offer it for one reason or another. And that's an important number because that's essentially, those are like the kind of the marginal or the rule breaker programs. They're right outside of the envelope that we're supposed to be in. The envelope would have been essentially, if it was under the minimum, it got canceled. The number of full classes is, there's a field registration data that indicates, okay, this class is now full, we're done. There is also a wait list number, and we counted how many classes had a wait list. Again, just clarifying, not the number of people on that wait list. So there were 4 full classes out of those 12 basketball classes. 3 of those classes, presumably 3 of the classes that were full, have a wait list. And so 58% of the overall classes, so 7 out of 12 were full or waitlisted overall. So it gives a little bit of that double count. We've talked about that a little bit, but that's the breakdown across one of those rows.
Right.
Yeah.
Just on the question, I would have to look at the detail behind this to understand it. But sometimes, like with debate, what can happen is, particularly with some of these academic classes, which is an interesting topic in and of itself, that we should do it at all. Actually, we shouldn't really be in the business, and I've been withdrawing them from our program offering for other reasons we can talk about. But what can happen is parents can sign up their kids for a program, and then after the first day of class, the kid doesn't want to go anymore. I'm not going back to that. But we had waitlists already, so you can end up having a class that ends up not being full in the final analysis of the data, but does have waitlists. And I don't know if that's happened here, but that happens more often in our academic classes than some of the other ones. So, yeah, shocking.
So,
And they don't get billed?
They don't, because the class has already begun, and we don't prorate for fees for camps. But more importantly, parents need to organize their summer way in advance, so when it comes time to that child not coming back to that camp, it's too late. The parent that was on the wait list now is signed on to something else.
and that's one of the things, tricky part of snapshotting programming data. We've taken a year out of data and said, this is what the most recent year looks like, and the problem with snapshotting something that is that flexible is that you run into a lot of those things. One of the things that was clarified for us, and I want to bring up real quickly, even though it's not one of our highlighted lines, is adult aquatics. Very, very small program, as you can see from the numbers in the summary. And on top of that, the instructor who is responsible for a lot of the classes, which is why there are so many cancellations, had a medical issue that essentially prevented the person from offering those classes. And so this was an outlier year out of a small program. We decided ultimately we weren't going to try to adjust numbers or rule it out or anything because it's such a small line item in the grand scheme of things. But we did get that clarification from our aquatics section director, and he offered that suggestion, and I believe that I had clarified that in the bullets in the document. So just really quickly, I want to run through just the columns here that are particularly interesting. I think what we're touching on right now is the critical one, which is the capacity of bookings. So in the data needs summary that was handed out this evening, the criteria define, if you're looking at that table for middle school or for day camps, our first highlighted column here, and you look at the numbers, this will dictate essentially, are we over, are we at, or are we below our capacity overall. And so the numbers on that are different than on that one. So put that away. The numbers on that, I think I touched on. So if it's below capacity, more than 33% of the classes, so they're getting canceled. So we're canceling a third of the classes that we're offering. We have capacity in that, that program, obviously. These, by the way, are based on natural breaks in the data that we were observing as we went through. We kind of could break these out into categories pretty well. At capacity, we were saying, well, it's less than a third of the classes are not meeting minimums that actually ended up jumping up. But
Where are you?
I'm looking at the criteria on page 7 of the data needs summary document.
So, row 36, and then on day camps.
On the right.
Column F.
Column F. And so this is why day camps is over,
Because they had more than 33% of their classes full or waitlisted, and less than 10% of their classes were canceled. So we gave a little bit of credit for the fact that sometimes things get canceled for reasons that are beyond anybody's control. So you can't get to 100, usually you can't get to 100% utilization in anything. You look at room bookings, you look at real estate, you look at whatever, you're gonna have some capacity left. So we're not gonna get to 100%, but we said less than 10%, and that we were seeing most of or a third of our classes go over that wait list or full criteria. And so that's a really important one as you look through these, because overall, there were several that were definitely over, and day camps was one of them. Interestingly, day camps, as you move through these, the expressed need was very low. We did not hear much at all about day camps. But we know from the program data and from the professional opinions of the staff and the overall enrollment, these are actually a very critical and a huge part of the effort of what the recreation group is working on. And so as we kind of pulled those two things together, we definitely see the demand for that has the potential to increase, but also that there is a high need for that evolving variety. It's like there's going to be an ongoing need for day camps.
When you said you didn't hear an expressed need, what are you referring to?
So the express need, again, back in the data needs summary talks about, did we hear about this as an area that needed to be expanded across multiple different input?
From people?
From the community,
Yeah.
from the community.
How?
All of our different, we have half a dozen or more public involvement efforts that we resolved over that. We have each of the sources is listed across the top of the matrix, and we looked at, did we hear about it in the intercepts? Okay, that's one. Did we hear about it in the focus, or did we hear about it in the workshops? That's another. Did we hear about it in MAPA? Did we hear about it in the survey? As we started racking those up, if we were hearing a consistent message across multiple areas, that's where it got to be high.
And in the case of day camps, it really just didn't come up. It really just didn't come up, and it may be that it's a thing that people,
Just think
parents
it's
need.
going really well.
And you have, and so it just didn't come up. But there weren't write-in comments, whereas many other things, people would bring it up, they would write in comments, but we just didn't hear a lot about it. And I think what Ryan is trying to illustrate is, just because we didn't hear a lot about it doesn't mean that people don't want it, because they're clearly signing up for the many, many camps that are offered.
The one other piece that I want to bring your attention to is this, the additional meetings log. The additional data that we provided here is the key points from a variety of meetings we've been holding with your professional staff, as well as stakeholders that are related to particular topics. This is an effort that we've been doing partly in response to your questions, partly at the suggestion of your staff, and partly because it just needed to be happening to clarify individual details. We didn't provide great depth of detail. What we were really looking for was what were some of the key points that we heard from each of these groups. And so this is referenced in several places under source 17. It's one of the updates that you'll be receiving regularly. And so I just wanted to note that in the programming area, there were a couple of groups that were really relevant here. The aquatics group, which was users, coaches, as well as your aquatics staff. There was the sports field users, and there were the Coverly Community Center tenants. And we also had middle school athletics. We had a group that was the middle school athletic directors, the program directors. We had a conversation with the Boost program, both the staff and the folks that are participating in that class, and some of the instructors. And so each of those pieces is really fleshed out some of our inputs. We're not taking that as a, like, oh, it was said once in this meeting, that's absolutely, the gospel, but we see these people that we invited to these conversations as being experts in the area that they're talking about. And so we wanted to make sure that their opinions and everything else got documented with some credibility across this process. Thank you all.
Okay, so with day camps, as I mentioned, this really highlights the extensive use of the existing programs, it not being mentioned a lot by the public. When we look in column I at demographic needs, you've got, again, a pretty stable youth population. We're not looking for, a spike in the youth population, so we see the demand that you have is probably going to continue at about the same level. So then barriers to participation, they seem to be low. Looking at source 5 where you're offering the programs, you're offering them in a lot of locations at a lot of times, and when you just look at the list of them, the staff really provides many offerings tailored to a lot of different interests. So there's something for just about anyone at a location that they can get to. So low on that one. Projected demand, because these things are selling out, and because of the interest in this community and the people who live here in making sure youth have positive activities, we see there's going to continue to be a strong demand for the level of programming that we have now. And therefore, our summary statement is that there's going to be solid demand, and there's going to continue to be a need to evolve those day camps, because the same static set is not going to continue to meet the interests of that youth population. I think Rob illustrated with the my parents signed me up for something that I hate example is a very illustrative of the youth population. So any thoughts on that one? We thought that was really pretty interesting.
Yeah, let your kids pick the camps.
Yeah.
Part of this process is going to be kind of a gut check of whether this summary of needs sounds right to you based on your experience, and that's kind of another data layer, if you will, is what you hear from people who know that you're on the Parks and Rec Commission, what you hear anecdotally day to day in your lives as parents and residents of Palo Alto. And that's not necessarily reflected here, but that's why we wanted to walk through, this is the process based again on the information we have. Here's what we describe as a summary of need, and then from there, does that sound right? Does that sound absolutely wrong? If it sounds wrong, we have this paper trail we can dig back into. That's why we have this enormous binder of stuff. Maybe we did get it wrong, or maybe it's just a difference of opinions, and the people who showed up at our workshop are not the people who value day camps. But overall questions, concerns, comments at this point?
I have a question about the youth and teen sports.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to find it in the program analysis part 2.
So youth and teen sports are...
For both adult sports and youth sports, for example, for adults, page 25, table 5 is adult sports, and you list number of classes for basketball, lawn bowling. Are these classes to learn how to play the sport, or are these teams?
They're teams.
They're city-sponsored teams?
Yeah, adult sports leagues.
Okay. So soccer, obviously, we have, they're leagues as opposed to teams?
Well, let's see. These are teams, but it's not participants. So we run adult sports leagues, and people sign up by team.
So, for example, this is different from the passive soccer.
Yes.
Yeah, that is different and separate. I didn't even know that the city had a soccer team.
Yeah, it's just one. That's it's a bit of an outlier, that one. I think we did one, and this isn't an ongoing one either. This must have been pulled from a specific season, maybe last fall.
But that is an important clarification. All of the programs in the program section are the programs that are offered by the city of Palo Alto. When we jump back to recreation facilities and we talk about your sports fields, there's a lot of other user groups and leagues who provide programming, who are booking time on those particular facilities. But in the programs, it's specific programs that Rob's staff is offering, is advertising. People can go on your website and sign up. So
then on page 30, table 11, youth and teen sports. Are those also teams then and not classes?
capoeira would be really what we think of as a class. And then I think
Is this
it's not a
table
team.
10?
Table 11.
Uh,
So for basketball, soccer, and tennis, I guess, are those teams? We have 80 tennis teams, or are
No.
those, because tennis is lessons, right?
Yeah,
I think
these are
so.
classes.
All of them are? Teams
Yes,
do
they are.
basketball and soccer? And they're different from
Yes.
the summer camps?
They are.
And different from the middle
It's
school.
not middle school athletics either. These are special interest classes related to sports for youth and students.
So I'd just
So-
like a little bit more clarification in the
Yeah.
document for both of those
Well,
categories.
some of these tables have a little description underneath them that is helpful maybe.
And another question I had on that same document is on the adult special interest classes and the senior, did you have a separate breakout for senior classes? I can't remember. Anyway, my question is, are the items listed primarily offered through Avenidas, the ones that are available to seniors, or do we have a separate list of programs that the city does for seniors as opposed to that Avenidas does with whatever grant they get from the city?
So it's separate, so there isn't anything in these tables that is run by Avenidas.
Okay, so we don't yet have any data in any place of what Avenidas is doing.
Actually,
We might do, because we met with them. a couple
yeah,
times,
so actually in the thing that Ryan
It's not in the
referenced,
list, but
Yeah.
it's not in any of the data sources.
it's actually referenced in the table in a few places, because Avenidas, when we get to facilities and they reported about what the demand they see for the programs that they offer and for the use of their facilities. So in the additional meeting log, that there are some findings from that meeting that start to present information about their programs. And what they find with their user base. We learned also quite a bit about the percentage of programs, where their focuses are, because they have certain focus areas, and, what is more drop-in and what is more of a day-to-day program. So
And that's reflected in the conclusions representative matrix.
not for senior programs, because those are city of Palo Alto
Not in
programs,
the
but in the
capacity
facilities.
thing, but in
Yeah.
this big chart.
Yeah, in the facilities in particular, yes.
Yeah, I think, I understand what you're saying. So how do we in the end, figure out, just say, let's assume that there's a need for low-impact aerobics for seniors. And so where does that get drawn out? And if it gets drawn out from a conversation with one of our major senior provider, Avenidas, who we'll talk to them earlier, where does that sort of percolate to so that it can be represented as a need? It's not in this document, the one we're looking at right now, because this is just looking at city programs, and it's not looking at senior programs very much, because we don't do a lot of them. So I think it's a fair question. I'm not sure what specific data source. I know we have it because we've had these focus group meetings, and we've gotten from Avenidas where they see that trends going for programming for senior services, and it's really interesting conversation. Where is that in the binder, I guess?
Well, it'll be on this source 17, and so, for example, on page 4 of that additional meeting log, the top column is the meeting with Avenidas, which Rob and I both attended. So they had quite a bit of data about the need for a second senior center on the south side of Palo Alto. They have data on where their participants are coming from. they know the way people use space and know at their current center, there's a need for social gathering space, and that would be something that would be needed in a new center.
So have they shared any of that data with you, or have they only shared their conclusions based on their data?
We asked them for the data, and I believe they do a I want to say it's biannual survey that has, hundreds of seniors participate, and they sent us the most recent survey that they did. And it talked about programs and services and other things. So we have it, they sent it to us.
And what about data on capacity? Maybe, can I just back up for a second?
They took just about the capacity, they took a lot of that capacity, and they're trying to rebuild.
They're
It's
adding.
actually, it's a city building, right, that they lease, and we're a long-term contract with them, but they are funding, want to fund a $15 million capital improvement primarily for increased program space for that particular age group, because it's growing so much and it's expected to grow over the next 20 years.
So can you just take a second to explain to us what is the relationship between the city and Avenidas? It's my understanding that Avenidas, the city provided most of its funding that's targeted towards seniors went to Avenida to provide the service. Is that correct?
It is correct. So there's a long history with Avenidas.
Yeah.
Many years ago, the city ran programs for senior services, but this was like in the early 70s. And I want to say it was 1977, somewhere around there, where we entered into an agreement and established a nonprofit called Avenidas to run senior programs and services for the community. And we provided the initial seed money to get them started. And we've done that ever since.
What was the advantage of having a separate nonprofit as opposed to the city doing it?
There's a number of advantages, not the least of which is a nonprofit can raise money, where a city really can't, and they're more nimble, can make decisions maybe a little bit quicker and adapt a little bit quicker than a city can. So at that time, the thought was they would provide a better set of services than the city could with the same amount of money. And so we've been funding Avenidas throughout those years, and I'm sure it's gone up over those years. And at this point, I think we're paying, I want to say something like $500,000 to Avenidas annually. It may be a little more than that, but what they've been able to do then is leverage that $500,000, and now they have $4+ million program that they run. That is,
Do you just give them a chunk of money, or do you
We
give
do.
them so much per class or so much per person?
well, it's not sort of, it's really, we give them the funding, and then it's our Office of Human Services, Minka Van Schlag and staff, work closely with their executive director, and there's some evaluation process of what the programming and services they provide, the evaluations of how satisfied Avenidas participants are. And so within the contract, there is that evaluation process that happens. They've been able to leverage the city funding significantly. So to the point where now, in terms of the program, the city funding is maybe 10 or 15% of their actual program. Does that help?
Yeah, I think that helps. I think that the thing I keep struggling with is they are our primary service provider to seniors, and we don't have the capacity bookings is unknown on our chart, and we don't know how it breaks out in terms, their services break out in terms of adult aquatics, adult fitness, adult special interest classes. All these things we have broken out from city offered services. We don't know what role Avenida plays in meeting that need. So when we look at the need on this chart, that says, that's just based on what we offer.
Exactly.
If we're not meeting the need, if what we offer is oversubscribed, we're going to have a high need indicated here. But if we don't have a bigger picture of across the community, whether seniors' needs are being met.
So in some cases, in the summary of need, and seniors would be a good place to maybe consider doing something like that when there are either a number of other providers, like in the health and fitness realm, or where there's one really kind of heavy hitter, we're noting their existence. It's something to think about when you get to the next step about how do you prioritize things. And I think that's a really, really good point, because you may decide like you did in the past, we're actually more effective if we work through them. I will say their focus is not recreation. They were pretty clear on that. They offer some recreation programs, and they have kind of, you know, the sort of drop-in seniors who are more mobile and who may come for a personal finance class, and then they have the people that are there every day for food programs who are much less mobile and really need more kind of social support, which,
It's Bridge, it's the big,
yeah,
the big player.
that was another one, yeah.
The Bridge.
The Bridge program.
Yeah.
So,
Kind of in relationship to that, where are the conditioning classes for seniors? I know my own family members are taking conditioning classes at Coverly. Are those, because once you get to be old, you want to work with weights and condition your body, and that's a really important venue, but I didn't see it reflected into these tables. So is that because Avenidas is covering body conditioning classes? Am I missing them, or?
No, but I mean, there are others other than Avenidas providing those programs too. You think about the JCC, there's a whole series of recreation programs targeted to senior services. So does actually the Palo family-wide. Yeah, there's lots of programming targeted for seniors in that area. So
Seems confusing to me. If you're a senior in this community
Yeah.
and you need a conditioning class to keep your muscles strong, let's say your primary care doctor says, your muscle tone is getting low, I would like you to go to a conditioning class. It's a very common experience of people hitting their 70s. Where do they go to find a conditioning class? If they're a Palo Alto resident, they might go first of all to our recreation handouts.
So then we would send them to Avenidas most likely. The Avenidas does have they really do understand the needs of seniors and have relationships with a lot of these partner organizations like the JCC.
So if they go to the schedules that you publish for Palo Alto classes, are you going to list all the Avenidas classes within that?
We do list in the catalog our partner organizations. We don't list all of their classes because there's a lot in the catalog.
it would be difficult,
Large,
yeah.
we list their organization and a web link and a phone number.
So it sort of comes down to envisioning, how we want to where we want to put our resources as a city, and right now,
Yeah.
those are almost contracted out. The concept is they're sort of contracted out.
Right.
Because I just don't see basic muscle conditioning classes listed in our charts here.
Yeah, we wouldn't be the primary provider of that as a city. We would, if someone calls us, we would talk to that resident, tell them about Avenidas, that they have, it's sort of the repository for all senior services. Not that they do them all, but they have a relationship with Y, they have a relationship with JCC, they do things with us, with the city that we do together. And so that would be the first place to start for someone that would be interested.
And so to your point, Deirdre, I think that, again, as we move into that next stage, is that the right role for the city? Do we have, are they, is the city?
A broker.
Yeah, and a referral service, because I think bringing it down to the reality of, as an individual, what do you experience? It's an issue that you see in a lot of places. It makes so much sense when you're, well, we do it this way and that way, but when you're just a resident out there, it's like, well, where do I go? And so there is actually a pretty robust way of connecting people to Avenidas, but you may decide as a Parks and Recreation Commission, you want to take that further, or you want to go in a different direction.
I guess I would want good data on it. Like if we have our average residents who's in their 70s, is it at their fingertips that they know where to go for a conditioning class? If we just poll people in the 70s, do they know how to hook in already? Is it just a done deal for them? Or is there a gap there in our aging population? They don't know where to go. That's all I'm concerned about. In some ways I don't really care who's providing it on. I just want to make sure that when someone hits their 70s, they go to their primary care doctor, they're told, go find a conditioning class as your muscles are getting weak, that they know how to do it.
Yeah, and I think there's an answer to that, Deirdre, because I know we're working with PAM, for instance, and with Stanford Hospital with primary care physicians, so that actually when they want to prescribe exercise, they actually hand out material to Avenidas, to the JCC, and to some extent to the City of Palo Alto for programs that we provide. So there is there is that link. But to this point, which is maybe a bigger question, it might be helpful to have the executive director of Avenues come to a commission meeting and do a little 10, 15-minute presentation on what they're.
I think that would be good to have a
Yeah.
discussion. I mean, we're a little off topic here because this doesn't directly apply to.
But I think it's a good
I
topic
looked for
because.
it, and I just didn't see it, so that's
Yeah.
that's
Oh,
the
yeah.
origin of my question. I didn't see it in our charts here.
Yeah.
Sort of
So-
like what Commissioner Heatherly might have been getting at. That was my question, is I don't see these types of conditioning exercise classes for seniors that I hear through my own family members. I think
Yeah.
they're hooking in with
And
them.
is that the gap? And is that where, if we have some resources, do we focus it there? So that's what I'm trying to get. So with senior programs, I don't know if we have all the answers here, but as we look at the city's recreation programs and the city's park system, what is it that we should focus in on for fulfilling a need there, recognizing that Avenidas does some part, JCC does, where is that gap? And we're trying to get to some of that with these focus group meetings.
Okay.
Tom, he's got change to.
Change the tape.
Seniors are now reflecting on some of the conversations we had with Avenidas, but there was a strong interest in not having senior programs be whole senior programs. Really what their interest was is have the more accessible, adult programs generally more accessible to people of ages through age span. And that was really an important takeaway. And that's how it
The JCC no longer calls them senior, they call
Yeah.
them adults, yeah. Can I ask what the 6 highlighted, what does that indicate?
Those are the ones we're walking you through.
We were,
Those are- oh,
yeah,
just-
those-
So you could follow across.
Yeah,
the
because
lines.
Oh, okay.
as you could see when Ryan was on the unhighlighted one, is you lose track as you're going across if you're not putting your
Okay,
fingers.
those are examples as opposed to the top
Yeah,
6.
correct. Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Exactly. Just,
I have one comment that I want to get in before we move on to facilities. On page 20, at the bottom of the, yes, of the new handout, new materials for April PRC work session, was the, I'm sorry.
program.
This is the part 2 of the recreation program analysis. On page 20, there's a comment that is just kind of left there, and I think there's a lot of meat there from a planning standpoint. It says, youth and adult sports programs are not easily expanded regardless of popularity due to facility and instructor coach constraints. And then it refers us to the tables. The tables don't talk anything about the constraints at all. They just talk about the demand. And knowing what constraints are preventing us from fully meeting the demand is a very important topic.
And actually, it's a great segue to recreation facilities, and one of the highlighted ones we wanted to talk about was sports field needs, because as,
But also you mentioned coaches too, and it'd be very good to have expand
okay.
that topic, because if it's just a coach issue, then we have options. We can go out and we can hire third parties to come in and act as coaches. And whereas facilities, we have less.
Yeah,
leeway.
I agree that was a key finding. We did, in the data needs matrix highlights that you
Okay.
received tonight, we did flag that as an issue that was impacting capacity.
Okay. I
That's
just wanted to-
that stood out to us as well.
And when
Okay.
you get on this topic, can you frame it for regional need versus resident need? Because that plays in hugely.
Yeah, and that actually, before you got here, Deirdre, that's one of the framing pieces. We, because of your past policy directions and because of the pretty clear direction from Palo Altans through the survey, this is really looking at the need generated by Palo Alto residents, not the regional need. We understand and recognize that your residents may be going to Los Altos to play on a field and their residents may be coming to yours, and that balances out, but that we're not looking to capture the entire Santa Clara County thing with a magnet facility, because you could build the biggest thing in the world and probably fill it up from around the region. This is really targeted at the need generated by your residents, trying to match that, and then realize it'll balance out across the region if everybody carried their share.
Okay. And so from time, we have 1 hour left, and we have 30 minutes that we're allocating towards facilities, and then 30 minutes towards framework and policy questions. Is
Well,
that still your?
we were told we had till 8:30 with you, and that you had a few points of business you needed to take care of.
With them.
Yes,
The
so,
rest of the agenda.
Our plan of attack as of right now is to spend about 20 minutes on the recreation facilities and then 10 minutes on wrap-up, and just touch real quickly on what we'd identified there as the introduction to the framework and policy questions. We discussed, yeah,
next steps.
and then set the stage for next month's meeting and what we hope to accomplish there. Does that sound
Very
like
good.
okay for?
Can I
And
ask
then-
a question before we move on?
Yeah.
Max? I do have some comments on the stuff that was in the packet.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Should I hold those till next week? Should I email?
I think
next
if you
month,
could
email to them?
Give those to Peter, he will communicate those to us. Thank you.
Plus you did some additional analysis on Pacific Islanders and.
We did. There was another memo you received, was the survey follow-up based on our
Tell us
conversation.
tonight, how many you went out to and what the process was.
We did not do additional survey work. We did additional number crunching on the survey data we had before. I don't think we have room in our agenda tonight to talk about that, but we can talk about it next time. It is reflected in this matrix. It's been rolled up into that, or we can talk about it in May if there's specific questions. Okay.
So looking at recreation facilities, the two we wanted to highlight were diamond sports fields, and we can also kind of parallel rectangular sports fields, because I think they're kind of an interesting counterpoint. And then we also wanted to walk through special purpose buildings and parks. So those are things like we talked about earlier, the Baylands Interpretive Center, the Foothills Nature Interpretive Center. But let's start off with diamond sports fields. So when we look in column C, your inventory is, we have 19 total, and that includes the school district facilities that you program. And I think one of the important things around sports fields is you as a commission worked with staff to develop a policy that has some pretty clear priorities about how you allocate the field space that you have, given that it's a limited resource, and how do you balance the use of that. And so you're booking the time that you have, and as we move across this, we'll see that. So your level of control is high because you either own the fields or you have an agreement with the school district that allows you to use the fields that you use. When we look at the geographic analysis, these are concentrated at particular sites, and there's a particular map around that, and there's also a map around sites where where there's flat grass that you're doing practices and things on, and that people can also drop in at. In terms of capacity and bookings, you're at capacity. The reason you're at capacity is because of the policy that you developed to allocate that field use. And so you could, if you offered more field use, more field space, you provide more space, and it would get filled up. But right now, because your policies are set up to balance the use of what you have, you're at capacity, and it's not showing as over because you're taking all the time and you're dividing it out based on the availability that you have. So I think that's a really important one when it comes to your diamond sports fields. If you look above that at rectangular, you're actually over in the case of that one because you're getting more requests from additional groups than the time you have available. So even though you set the policies and you're sharing time out, there's documented more requests.
I don't understand. If you said that we're at capacity because we have not.
Because you've developed a policy that says, okay, we've got a certain amount of field time, and here's how we're going to prioritize assigning out that field time.
We've allocated everything.
But you said if we had more fields, we would fill those fields.
Because of insatiable demand.
Yeah, so
Only if we changed our policy.
Only if you change your policy, yeah. Like if you were going to allow regional demand, or you were going to allow, 40% Palo Alto residents rather than,
And it's always this calendar of use is always a biggie, like is it in the season or out of the season, pre-season, post-season?
it's in the season.
Right,
Yeah,
we're basing it on in-season.
in the
use.
season use, yes. So
I
then,
mean, achieving policy and allow more non-residents?
You know, allow more practice days a week, for example, for a team, instead of
Mhm.
having them only practice twice a week. If we let them practice 5 days a week, we would be well over capacity, because
Exactly.
many teams would prefer to practice more than twice a week. at
So,
the competitive level.
exactly, so in the case of Diamond Fields, you have effectively managed demand for those, and you're meeting it based on the policies that you set out. The perception of quality is medium, you know, people have mixed opinions, it's pretty good, certain things could be better, and there's data from several sources around that. If you look to source 13, there's one in particular that we pulled out. So with Diamond Sports Fields, then you get to expressed need, and in source 14, so that is the survey results, you see that reported as a high. So again, this is different from being at capacity. So this is about, what we'd like to practice 5 times, or we'd like to have a couple of games a week. So that is reflecting the expressed need, but it is not showing up as being over capacity because of how you're managing demand for your policies. When you look at demographic trends, we are predicting a decline because nationwide you see a decline in diamond sports. And so we can debate that, but I would, as a professional, I would say that we're not going to see an increase in that. It's, really there's a downward
I
trend.
mean, if you look in the past 5 years, that we're serving more baseball and softball players now than we did 5 years ago. Whether you're looking 10 years in the future, that's another story,
Yep.
but the trend certainly is up.
Well, the overall trend though nationally, in terms of baseball participation, it's on a downward trend, in softball as well.
Yes, but we're still just looking at Palo Alto,
Yeah.
because it's pretty high demand, and they would fill the space if we had more.
Okay. Yeah, your thoughts on that are that it's either stable or increased.
Yeah, if you look at the past 5 years, it has been increasing.
And so a question that I would ask you, because we see this in some communities, what you see is a small percentage of people who want to play more and more in more leagues. And so I think that's also an important part of teasing apart that trend.
I think part of that, Keith, is also that in the past 5 to 10 years, elementary enrollment has been increasing. And as we
Yes.
look to the forward, we expect it to decline.
Yes, that is true.
So that will affect the
Mhm.
usage trend as well.
Yeah, because in all of those team sports, it's kind of the 13 and unders where you have your peaks and then it sort of drops off because you either continue playing in high school or you stop. Okay, so then barriers to participation, medium from sources 8 and 9, and that's about where the fields are located and the existing conditions, the configurations. And
So we, just on the baseball diamonds, we do have the Babe Ruth League that
Mhm.
uses our fields, and so, like you're saying, it can fall off, but then we have this specialized club structure within our city that has some regional draw. So did you put that in your analysis? We have a whole diamond dedicated to that, the Babe Ruth.
We did not do some kind of, what's the Babe Ruth specific demand. What we're looking at is the overall, bookings using your system. How does that
Is
work?
that system that you analyzed outside of the Babe Ruth system, or does it include it? I just need a point of clarification there. The data you were looking at.
No, in the Diamond Sports Fields, it's anybody that's booking your time. So it's outside leagues, it's tournaments, and we have real specific guidance about how much each of the user groups can do in terms of
Can I
tournaments.
re-ask that question?
Yeah.
The 19 total diamond fields, does that include the bigger field?
You'll look on the
It
inventory.
should do, yeah.
It should.
I think that might get to your,
Yeah, no, I just,
Yeah.
so they're rolled into this analysis.
Yeah.
okay.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's good.
Yeah, because that'll be, the fields that are counted will be right on notice inventory.
Right, and they're kind of
sheet.
self-contained, they have their own dedicated space.
Okay.
Well, high schools are included in this, in this number as well, and generally those are not available for use, that's what it says.
Yeah, they currently are not available for use.
So that kind of overstates it, but
Well, I'm not sure that's exactly right. I mean, so the high schools use those fields, and then the high schools themselves rent out those fields.
They rent them out.
So they don't use the city of Palo Alto's brokering process to make them available to the public.
And they keep the
And
money,
they make it available, but not on the same criteria.
but they also don't rent out to,
Prioritize residents.
They don't.
they don't, they rent to outside teams.
Right.
Yeah.
I don't think we can count that as ours.
Mm-mm.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Do we, like counting the JCC or something like that?
So if you look on the inventory, the physical inventory, the baseball and softball fields, you can see the school inventory is there. And yes, Palo Alto High School, those fields are included. And certainly, if you felt like we should reduce, do they count in the inventory? That would be a really good, feedback point that they shouldn't count.
I've always felt that they should be folded in, that they're a resource. I don't understand why they can generate all this revenue on their property when there's this whole relationship between the city and the schools.
They're not in the agreement, the original agreement of the field, the shared use spaces.
I know, I guess I would question whether we should evaluate that as a commission.
We can't, it's not in our
It's not part
purview,
of it.
that's school district property, it's not us. We can't.
Whereas the middle schools are different, you're saying.
No, the middle schools have a brokered system with an agreement with the city, but the high schools do not.
So I'm saying, can the city ever formulate an agreement, if necessary, with the high schools? That's
It
my
would be-
I
question.
would hope they would.
Yes.
If the school district wanted to do that, we're in a contract with the school district to maintain like the elementary schools and the middle schools, and in exchange for this relationship, we get to broker those spaces outside of school hours.
So we
The school-
benefit.
Yeah, and the public benefits, but the school district has not been interested in doing the same thing for high schools, largely because they have a very robust athletic program, and the athletic directors of the high schools really want to have the ownership of their fields and who gets on those fields. Now, do they rent them out themselves and then generate revenue? They do. I don't know enough about that, though, to speak to who actually gets on those fields and what criteria they use. I'd like to know more about it.
Great.
And I'd love to have more access, because we certainly have the need for fields.
So how do we learn more about it?
That's not related to this, though,
Well,
it's getting into the weeds
So we
again.
can, we'll flag that as an issue.
I think it's
Well,
a capacity.
I think it brings up a point. You can use the plan as a tool. You, as the commission, could say, we should have a recommendation in here that we
Yeah,
should
that's
seek enhanced access at the high schools because there is a need in the community. The community doesn't see a difference. We have this data, and we would like to see those brought into the system. You can't make the school district do it,
Right.
but you can say, we'd like that to happen, and we would like councils, sort of buy off that is a direction. And so the plan can be a tool to try to move in those directions, keeping in mind you can't control
Right, I
what they
understand.
do. But yeah, I
For the
think it's a
purposes
great
of this,
point.
though, I would argue strongly for removing the school district fields from this particular representation, because I think it is a misrepresentation of what's
Because they're
available to
different from
high
the
school.
elementary sites.
the high school, the high schools.
Okay.
Okay, I think
Or you
that's,
could even, and just even footnote it saying high school's not
Yeah, they're there, but we don't have, we can't.
Yeah, it's good to have an inventory, but you might have to separate it out. I think visibility is good though, to see what the inventory is.
Okay, we could, yeah, I think it would be good to footnote, you know, perhaps which ones are subject to the agreement, or maybe just because it's the two high schools that are outside of that, that to footnote that those are outside of the agreement and you don't book time on those.
Yeah.
Okay, and then make sure that's reflected in the discussion. Okay.
I actually had a comment, it was column E.
Sure.
You had off-leash dog areas, and then right below it, community gardens. And in community gardens, you have them all clustered in the north end. I'd like to see that same thing in the off-leash dog areas as all clustered in the south end, just so it spells it out more and it's consistent.
No, that's a good point, because that was specific feedback from the Palo Alto dog owners group, actually, that if they're all clustered, they're, you know, we really need them spread out, so.
So Lauren, do you want to make a couple more points about diamond versus rectangular?
Well, I think that
Touch on the building.
the rectangular, there's some of the same patterns. I think some of the same issues around the sports fields are going to be the same. We should make that same footnote and consider taking the high school fields out of the inventory. But what we did hear from multiple sources and see on trends is the increase in rectangular sports, and so there's some higher demand there because there's more sports that are playing on rectangular fields for more part of the year. And so on that one, there's, you know, kind of a higher need. However, that can be accommodated in, you know, a number of ways, whether it's by increasing playable time on your own fields, getting access to other fields. But I think it's important to look at both rectangular and diamond fields and also understand the seasons of the year where those are played, which this does not capture that as much. So I'd like, because we're getting really close, I'd like to move on quickly to the special purpose buildings. That came up right at the beginning. This is the Baylands Nature Center, Foothills, Rostradero, those special purpose buildings for which the city has a high level of control in column D. When we look at those, they're really located at the preserves. There's a few other special purpose buildings, but the most significant ones are those centers that are in the preserves. We don't have any data on capacity and bookings. There is a perception that the quality of those is low, that they're difficult to program as they are now, just because of their configuration and their age. There is a medium expressed need, and again, some of this is through those follow-up meetings because there's a desire to do outdoor programming and interpretive classes, yet not really the space to do it because the spaces aren't suitable, and there isn't really data on the demographic trends because those programs aren't really offered, so we don't know who's participating in them, but in terms of the barriers to participation, because
Are you talking about the buildings themselves or the programming in the buildings, or both?
Buildings.
the buildings because they're kind of a place, they're a place for programming. I mean, they only exist because you want to do something with them. Otherwise, it'd be like a storage facility or something like that.
When I look at your additional, I want to know that I can go to the document that you're citing on additional meetings and see that data. But when I go to your additional meeting log, I don't see anything on these centers.
It's,
Where is
the
it
meeting with
located?
John Aiken on page 3. So you know him well from his role at the Junior Museum and Zoo, and he's been a wonderful source in a variety of areas. And one of them was around the outdoor programming. And we met with him specifically about these special purpose buildings. So on page 3, there's key points that are summarized from that discussion. He has a vision for how they would program using some of the educational initiatives and curriculum that they have in place. What he sees with the, as an example with Baylands, there's 2 classrooms, neither of them works really well for the types of classes that they would offer. And so it doesn't really work well for their needs, but it also doesn't really function as kind of a museum space, which it seems. He sees a need at all these sites for his volunteer programs, staging areas, which these buildings could potentially function as. So people need a place to have lunch, to get oriented in the morning, to have tool storage, have a place to use the restroom. One of the things that he also brought up in that is there's a lot of things you could interpret at any of these sites, and so really thinking about what you wanted to interpret and how you wanted to interpret it, rather than being sort of scattershot, would be pretty important to determining the facility configurations, because it would have an implication there. So he was a really great source on that and has thought a lot about how can he do more to meet the demand that he's seeing, because he said, I can fill programs, I just don't have, basically a platform from which I can do it using these buildings.
Are those spaces, the interpretive centers, reservable by the public?
Yes, the gateway facility at Restradero, I don't think it is, but the meeting room up at Football Park is, and the Baylands Interpretive Center is the main room.
So it says any for capacity, we don't have that information. If they're bookable, we should have that information somewhere.
Yeah, if they're bookable, that's online, you can get the information, it's in the municipal fee schedule.
Balin's Interpretive Center's closed.
It's open 3 days a week, minimal hours. It's
Not during high tide.
We have a lot of classes that go there, and we program that space. Actually, with John through the Junior Museum, so there isn't enough staff and resources to keep it open on a regular basis. So it is closed a lot.
But that booking data information is available, we can get it into the matrix.
Well, yes and no, because there's the class booking times, which would appear, kind of in class data, and then there's the, you walk in
Facility
and
space.
you do, the facility space as, I'm Audubon and I want to rent this facility. And we can inquire about that, but.
I just think in your table, you should reflect that John Aiken is talking about those facilities. If they're not even listed on the table,
Okay.
just to make it more
Rather
clear
than-
that he's the one who's
Sure.
giving you the information.
Sure, I think that's a really good clarification, because he wears a lot of hats, and, it's tied to the Junior Museum and Zoo, but in this case, he was.
And his
thinking-
focus is really the Junior Museum and the Zoo, and I don't think he has a strong focus at the Baylands.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't.
His focus really is the Junior Museum.
And so I think it's an unmet need. We don't have anyone who's really focused there.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, ideally, we would have a naturalist that is on staff and has their office there. at
That's
the
kind of a
Baylands.
self-fulfilling prophecy. If you don't have the staff, you start to not have the time, the facility is no longer open, the need
So
falls off.
there was an extra category besides facilities and programming, that which is when the interpretive center was open. If it was a hot sunny day, or you needed a drink of water or bathroom, or you wanted to go in and look at the exhibits and talk to a naturalist, you could do that. It wasn't programming and it wasn't reservable space, but it was accessed by the public.
Yeah.
It used to
Prior
be
to
like that.
2008, we did have that staffing, good. And this interpretive center was open a lot more.
And so that's actually one of the reasons for, high barriers to participation, because they're just not open very much. Or for, when a class is in session, it might be open but not necessarily when you happen to be there and maybe, yeah, needed to get a
Barriers
variance.
are high, yeah.
And that's why this projected demand being low, I don't quite understand that.
This would be a point of discussion.
How did you come up with that?
So, we came up with that because we were thinking about these buildings, if they were achieving, what they're supposed to do as what they are, you don't need more of them. So if you look at the findings, there's no need for additional facilities. Like, you wouldn't build 4 more of these things. However, the facilities that you have are not meeting expectations, and we see there's a real need for them to meet expectations because people really want to connect to nature and they want to have preservation of nature. If you look up at rows 11 and 12. And there's a high need for both of those. And so there's the rub.
But you have 2 bullet points. One says need for additional facilities. Then the other one, need exists for facilities, but then you came up with a low. So is that based on buildings or that category of, I think you already talked about this maybe?
Yeah.
What is the category of projected demand based on? Is it facilities or programming?
And when we get to facilities, it's kind of both. There are factors with both for certain facilities, and so the projected demand, the reason that we put a low is because of the criteria here. We don't see you capturing necessarily, and this is debatable, you may make a different judgment, new user groups. However, we don't think those buildings are functioning as they should, and that they need investment. And so you could make an argument that you would capture an expanded use. It's kind of slicing it fine. We just don't, yeah.
Can you point me to where the criteria is written down? I'm sorry, I
Absolutely.
lost it.
Page 9 of the data and needs summary concept. Or projected demand.
That's the one you handed out today?
Yeah,
Page
it was an
9.
updated version of the one that you
Because I
said
just,
before.
if you have it in the criteria, I'm sorry, I just
Yeah.
missed that.
So that's a good place to stop, both because we're almost out of time, but because we want to talk about what we're going to do next. So overall, has this been a useful exercise? Is it starting to answer some of your questions? Do you feel like you're gaining a little more confidence in how the needs are based on the data that we have available to us?
I feel much better. I told Rob I feel much better now than I did a month ago.
Great.
Good. That's what
we're hoping.
we're trying for that.
So what we want to propose to move forward is to give you all more time to digest this. Obviously, there's questions, there's things you want to dig into and look up, probably to varying degrees. So we were going to suggest as a small homework assignment for about between now and 2 weeks from now. If you would take your top 3, so areas of interest, things that jumped out at you, pick 3 rows from this matrix, spend a little time going through it, do that gut check, see if it makes sense, see if there's, seems accurate to you, and then, see if the summary of needs makes sense. If not, flag that for us, and if yes, what questions does that trigger for you, or what would you like to do about what we found here, because that's going to kind of help us, lead us into the next step of the planning process, which is developing these actions and criteria and priorities and recommendations, and the policy questions that you all will need to answer in order to come up with those recommendations.
You're saying top 3 off of this top?
Top 3 off of the matrix.
Top 3 rows.
3 rows.
And if you want to do more, that's fine, but what we would ask is within 2 weeks, and we'll provide you a way to give your feedback to Peter electronically, so it's just consistent, and we can pull all of that together and have for you what you all have to say about your top 3, so you get it in your packet for your next meeting.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the next meeting, we can talk about that and see where we get, and if we're ready to...
So this is on a policy basis, we're not going to say we want more bowling classes.
No.
We think that there's a need here,
This is,
you said high demand, and we think it should be low.
yeah, based on the data that you're seeing here. I tracked back through these threads and I disagree, or I found this statement from this other thing, and I really think it's this direction, or even a comment, this doesn't jive with what I've heard, from either meetings at the PRC or in the, the community of people who I interact with in Palo
Can I
Alto.
just add that so
Yeah.
the most important thing though is to focus on the needs summary in the far right. And not focus on any one particular data source and cell if you think maybe you have a different opinion on how to read the data. Because really what we want to do is move to this direction to see the need to describe sufficiently and, it's that truth test. Is there enough information here and data that supports that need? And so those areas where you have a question about the need, and a lot of this, this is not surprising to me as I read through this. There's nothing new. There's a couple of things that are surprising to me a little bit that I would want to look into more closely. But most of it seems, about right, given what I'm hearing from the public, and but a few jump out. So I would encourage you to look at those, all those areas that you're particularly interested in, a topic, and dig deeper to see if it makes sense. And then as we come back next month, we have 7 commissioners, each looking at 3. We'll capture, I think, a lot of the questions that you may have. And hopefully, we can start to shift to what is really a lot of work, actually, and that is the prioritization of needs. Because what you see here, something jumped out at me, which is not surprising either, is there are a lot more needs than there is resources that we're going to be able to apply to these needs. And people love their parks and their recreation, right, in our community and use it. So the fact that most of these are high and medium high, mostly high, it's not surprising. So the next, much harder job really is then how do all of these needs as described stack up with one another in a prioritized fashion, and in terms of if we're going to apply resources and in what timeline and sequence would we do that. And that's going to be tricky. And the other piece to it is, this is a description of needs based on the data, but it doesn't really describe how we address those needs. It's kind of like Deirdre brought up the point about nature and the experience of nature. There's a lot of different ways you can do that, and some are more effective than others. And that's sort of the next part of the real meat of the plan itself, because that's going to define how we're going to work on our park system in the future and the choices that we make about how we design them. So we need to get past the description of needs, so we just start working on that.
And I think also as you're pondering all this, because there's a lot to ponder here, but I think when you're looking at these slices, you can start to see how if you kind of move one piece, you'd also, in some cases, move some of the other pieces, and to pick off that experienced nature, there's a number of ways you can do that, but in trying to meet that need, you might pick off some other needs. And so as we talk about that prioritization, as a commission, you really thinking about the criteria you want to use for how you prioritize things is going to be important. You may decide a lot of different things are important criteria. We may try out different sets of criteria and see how things shake out. And anyway, multiple benefit in some communities is an important criteria in deciding what to do first. So just, it's the start of a lot of work, but it is the place where we all want to go, like, what are we going to do?
Can I ask 2 quick clarification questions before our homework? The first question on line 38, open space and outdoor rec, it's under programming, under programs, so that's with regard to open space and outdoor recreation as opposed to the experienced nature up on line 11.
Exactly.
This is programming.
This is a program area
as opposed to
that,
the space itself. And then the other question is under the geographic analysis under column E, it points out difficult to access on foot or bike, yet the barriers is considered medium. So would that change its status, or is that just something that the other ones don't talk about their difficulty or accessibility in that column?
Accessing, my guess would be that the accessing the spaces is difficult by foot or bike, but because these are structured programs, there's some transportation support We could dig deeper into
And
it.
because of where, yeah, that may be the reason why this particular one within the programs, because they're being offered at the preserves or locations like that, not kind of dispersed or in central Palo Alto, that might be why there's that comment. And if you feel like that comment is off mark too, that's a really good piece of feedback, that it's not consistent.
And is public transit in that category of access along with foot or bike?
Transportation generally, I'm not sure that.
Yeah, I mean, there certainly is not at this point an analysis of, is there, a transit stop by the park? That's certainly something that could be looked at in the future. I would recommend it as a data point now, but, if you wanted to go in certain directions, you could say, is there transit there? If there's not, we should, focus this type of thing at sites with transit or work on getting it there.
Okay, great. And my last real quick one was on number 26. Row 26 is called recreation centers. Lucy Sturridge Park and Coverly, I always hear them referred to as community centers. When I think rec center, I think there's like a racquetball court and, fitness centers. We don't have any of that. I mean, we do some of that access at Coverly, but I just don't hear it referred that way in our community.
Okay, so title change there.
Those are not my 3 points. Those are prior to my 3 points.
You're doing your homework with us. Just when we're going to do this homework, do we have any data source on how many people are using the Baylands in our city?
No, there's not counts, there's not counts. Sometimes,
Lauren?
yeah.
I think.
Yeah, we actually, the ranger staff have, in the last year or so, have monitored accounting devices at several entrances to Baylands. So we're getting increasingly accurate numbers for visitation of Baylands.
But we don't have past data, I think, on those that's been reflected in any of this material, but.
Yeah, we have past data too. It's not contiguous. There's a break in time, but we've got data going back a ways. It's evolving because we're getting better and better at it. So when we used to track, it was one entrance to a preserve that has 10. So it's flawed data. It was the best we could do at the time, and now we've gotten better. So we're getting more and more accurate data. So I guess you're right. It's not apples to apples if you were to compare our 2000 data to this new. But we do have for foothills very clean numbers.
It'll just be interesting to have a city.
You can, though, look in the, in Mappada and some of the survey data, people are self-reporting which sites they're going to, and you can extrapolate from that also.
Yeah. I have 2 comments here about some things. Some of these are nice and crisp, and I understand what's going on. Some of them are not. For example, the demographic trends. Sometimes, for example, it's stable for gathering together, but it's increasing for picnic shelters. And I don't quite understand exactly why and the sources citing just say growing population. It has nothing that has anything to do with picnic shelters. So some of these growth things, I think, are just very arbitrary. And the other thing is the column K, the projected demand. That's a pretty important column, and I think it would be worthwhile to, when you get to the end, have a paragraph in each one saying, because some of this is professional judgment. Some of it's not numbers, and so it'd be good to have an explanation of why is that an H? And just a short explanation of why each of these, and granted that's going to be a few pages of writing, but I think that'd be very useful for us because that's one of the columns we're going to be really looking at is projecting forward, look for demand going forward.
So I think that's a nice piece of feedback, because if there's one place to put more verbiage, I think focusing it there makes a lot of sense.
Any questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We appreciate the work.
Oh, we really appreciated the excellent discussion tonight.
Gold stars all around.
So now do your homework, or
Yes.
we'll get after you.
We'll bring those stars for your homework.
Yeah. We're going to hold all the changes in the table, so we don't have our next item till next. Goat said to me, don't touch that cottage cheese, it's contaminated.
Okay. Next we are looking at Recommendation for park improvement ordinance for the batting cages at Baylands. Darren Anderson.
Good evening, I'm Darren Anderson with Open Space Parks and Golf, and I'm here tonight with an action item seeking your recommendation to council to adopt the park improvement ordinance, authorizing the addition of 2 batting cages and converting 1 standard parking stall to a handicapped accessible parking stall within the former Pasco site to Baylands Athletic Center. Staff had brought this project to the commission on February 24th, and the commission generally supported the project, but suggested that there should be a public meeting. On March 23rd, we held a public meeting at the Baylands Athletic Center to discuss the project. 6 members of the public and 2 commissioners attended the meeting, and all members of the public supported the project. There was a request to include a gate on the west end of the site to allow more efficient access to the batting cages. And after a little further examination, there is an existing gate there, and that will provide the requested access. I don't have a lot to add. Since the previous presentation covered the bulk of the project, there weren't a lot of outstanding questions. If there are any questions for me, I'm glad to answer.
What was the public comment?
Public comment was that on the west end, over here, if we had a gate, it would allow for easier access from the other field. And
No, I got that. Was there anything else? Like,
we support the project. It was nothing but support. It was largely athletic field supporter proponents. They were with other leagues. And maybe the commissioners who attended that would like to chime in if you have any thoughts on how that public meeting went from your perspective.
It was fairly non-eventful. The people there were all baseball people, and they supported the batting cages. Do you have any comments?
No, I think that's right. It was all baseball people, and they were all very supportive from all the different venues of baseball. And I understand, Darren, you also sent an email notice about the public meeting out to all the stakeholders, including all the environmental groups, and no one came or submitted comments. So I would move that we recommend the VIO passage for the.
I second it.
Any discussion? Okay, let's vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, it passes. Yeah, it was, we have some time.
Oh, no. She's good.
Okay. Darren, now we're going to talk about the drought. Drought response for parks, open space, and golf. Darren Anderson.
Thank you so much. Bear with me just a moment. We're pulling up a PowerPoint. Thank you so much. Here to give you an update on our drought situation and how it's affecting the city and what kind of things we'll be facing in the near future or already. As you probably already know, California's facing one of the most severe droughts on record. That Governor Brown declared a drought state of emergency in January and directed the state officials to take all necessary actions to prepare for water shortages. And this drought's going to have profound effects, especially on our area, on the open space. To some degree, we have a few irrigated areas that will be impacted, parks to a great degree, and the golf course to a great degree. We have to change the way we do business to address these demands and restrictions that will be coming our way. This next slide enumerates some of the you've probably heard a number of these different percentages floating around the news, which one pertains to us. The San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, this is our water provider, has on the books and hasn't changed it, a 10% voluntary reduction, and that's still in place. Santa Clara Valley Water District is calling for 30%, although we do not get our water from Santa Clara Valley Water District. And statewide, the governor's issued a 25% call for water reduction. This is potable water, not recycled water. And though the governor's is 25%, it is on a sliding scale per community. And so the state water board looks at each community and allocates you somewhere low, somewhere in 20, somewhere higher in the 30 range. Ours is, for the moment, at 24%. That's the bucket we've been allocated for now. It does seem that these things are kind of in flux and can change and have been changing. So I don't know exactly what it will be. And I'll keep hammering this home, but it's kind of draft form right now. And everything I'm going to tell you is where we're at in this moment in time and subject to change. We hope to know more soon. We'll be back in May to give you an update. On May 11th, the Utilities Department is going to bring a report to City Council on the drought and discuss the city's water shortage contingency plan. And this plan will discuss the 24% reduction, what that means for the city, and where we'll be making some of the restrictions to conserve that much water, how much we've made in previous years, and what we have left to do. There's also other restrictions. This is just a small snapshot of some of them coming our way, using potable water to wash sidewalks and driveways. That does actually have implications for the Parks Department. In the past, and in our maintenance contract with Kachina, we clean, this is a best management practice, or was, no longer in the drought, is clean tennis courts with a water broom. Gets the deeper cleaning out of the tennis courts, prolongs the life of the court itself, as opposed to using a blower or a broom or anything else. But that's just not best management practices in the drought. We've discontinued that for some time now, and we'll continue to discontinue that as well as other places. The runoff when irrigating with potable water, this is one that we get a lot. Unfortunately, a lot of complaints. We have a lot of citizens keeping an eye out for this, which is great. But it doesn't take much when you have hundreds of thousands of sprinkler heads scattered throughout the city for one sprinkler head to be either kicked, clogged, broken off by somebody, and then water can pour down onto the sidewalk, and you'll see that. And unfortunately, it gives us a black eye as if we're not monitoring it closely, but it just can happen so quickly. It's really incumbent upon my team to be on it, to be looking at it, to be really responsive when we get those complaints and fix it same day. Oftentimes we get it within the hour. I've got a really responsive manager in charge of irrigation, comes in on his days off, on the weekends to shut off valves, to fix things like that. So we're doing the best we can. Using potable water and decorative water features that do not have a recirculating function. And just for the record, we have Lytton Plaza has that fountain that is recirculating. So we have continued that practice. We're going to probably add some signage that explains, we're cognizant of the drought. This is a recirculating fountain. That's why we're allowing it to continue. The CalLab fountain will also be recirculating. It's not up and running yet, but that will too be a recirculating one, which is permissible under these restrictions. The outdoor irrigation during 48 hours following measurable precipitation. It's another one of those restrictions that will require us to be very cautious. Sometimes you'll see, maybe in the news, agencies making mistakes. It's rained yesterday, they come out and test irrigation. Can't do that anymore. And so we'll have to be kind of careful on ensuring that we're compliant with these. So as I mentioned, this is going to heavily impact my division, especially the open space parks and golf areas, that we're going to have to bear a lot of the burden because we're such a big user of the outside irrigation in the city of Palo Alto. And we need to help achieve that city goal of 25%, 24%, possibly more. We don't know at this point. And we've been working on a plan that's going to reduce significant amounts of irrigation. And I want to share with you the methodology and the initial thinking that's behind this kind of initial draft. We've put a lot of work into it, and it's just been evolving. We're still massaging into place, so bear with me when I show you what I'm about to, and understand it's kind of in the preliminary phases. But what we're doing is a park-by-park analysis, looking at all the irrigation that goes there. We're identifying the ornamental sections or aesthetic pieces of turf, and either recommending them for elimination, and that would mean just stop irrigation wholeheartedly there and cover it with either wood chips, let it go completely brown, maybe come back and plant some drought-resistant plants in some cases, but one of those kind of three options. And in this particular site, the Baylands Athletic Center, you can see we've got a couple different colors, and forgive me if you can't quite make out the colors, but we've outlined them. You can see orange is to reduce irrigation 2 times per month. And so there's a little sliver of the park where we have got turf and it's got trees in it, and we'd like to eliminate irrigation, but not entirely, because we don't want to kill the trees that are still dependent on it.
So we're having this back and forth with our tree department to say, are these trees the type that you think would make it? And if they say no, they need supplemental irrigation because that's how they've been sustaining themselves, because they're turf trees, they've established in turf, like these ones, that we're going to continue to irrigate, but very minimally. 2 times per month is more than enough to sustain those trees. The turf will die, and it'll look different. In another area, you'll see it's outlined in green, and that's eliminate entirely. And it's not without any impacts. There's an aesthetic impact. As you drive into this major athletic facility, we have these 2 strips or 3 strips of turf there, closest to the parking lot, that while not used for active play, has been used for warm-up, certainly a place where some people congregate. But if we don't make these changes, we don't believe we're going to be able to realize that 24% reduction. So we've got to make hard choices like this. And so what we've done in this initial pass with my staff is to kind of flush through and say, okay, these areas we're going to have to cut back. And what you'll see is the larger section, the actual playing field, is where we've kind of identified that as in yellow, saying that we're going to need to irrigate that one a little bit more. It's one we can't quite let go. It's an athletic field, it's highly brokered, it's highly used. And there's a safety component. But if you were to let it dry up, what would happen to it? It's a question we've been getting asked quite frequently. What's that going to look like if you went to 2 days a week or 1 day a week? Or it's really difficult to answer because every site's different. There's macro differences in the soil makeup, the irrigation system itself, the history of the field, how well how much it's used and brokered. And this particular site, our hunch is it's going to need at least not to exceed 5 days. So we will probably dial it back, and that's going to put some constraints on it, but we think we can keep it safe. We can still grow grass on it at 5 days a week, which will allow us to save some water, but in this particular area, we would still irrigate it maybe a little bit more than some of our other shots. Our parks like this one, where we look at Cameron Park. This park, we've outlined it completely in the light blue, which is to irrigate no more than 2 days a week. So basically, we would irrigate that entire park just 2 times a week. And that would result in changes. It's a big cutback. I can't say, lots of questions have come up, well, how often do you typically irrigate that? Well, it fluctuates with the season, right? During the winter, we're irrigating maybe not at all. If we have a dry winter, it's a couple days. In the peak of summer, it could be 6 to 7 days a week is the norm. So this site would definitely change. In the peak of summer, that would turn mostly brown. In some areas, we'd probably lose turf, is my guess. Little spots here and there, the turf would die away. And the ability to grow grass is not really possible irrigating 2 days a week. So at a site like this, if we implement a 2 day a week restriction or something like that, what you could expect in long term is some dead patches, lots of brown areas during the summer, and with luck, they would come back each year, and we'd do our best to make it look as good as we can, to make it safe for people to play there. So that's kind of the ideas of what we're doing. Every single site in the city where we irrigate, we're starting this. We start with the parks and the preserves. There's not a lot in the open space preserves. Really, it's Foothills Park where we've got an upper and lower turf that's irrigated. The rest of the preserves, there's very little. Most of it's native landscaping, which is, it's irrigated to establish, and then that's pretty much it. It's left on its own. The next steps, again, I mentioned that there's going to be a staff report going to the council on May 11th, and after that, we hope to know more, get some feedback from council, get some direction, and continue working on our site-by-site analysis. Hopefully, we've got a more firmed-up figure of what our cut's going to be, and then we can kind of use some of this analysis to say, okay, we can eliminate so many square feet of turf, how much water is that going to save us? Will we realize 24% reduction based off the 2013 baseline? And again, I hadn't mentioned that before, but that's our baseline year, 2013. For all my first slide, they talked about those different percentages. They're all predicated on the 2013 baseline.
And you also do this for the golf course?
Yes.
And so there will be some areas in the golf course that don't get watered as much?
Correct. Mainly the outer rough. We have got a great relationship with Valley Crest. The superintendent there, Brian Dunn, has been working closely with us. We've really got a good plan for the golf course. I feel confident we can make great strides there. It's interesting, that's one of the sites, one of our 3 that's on recycled water. So we've got, it's about a 70-30 blend right now, 70% recycled, 30% potable. Same is true for Greer Park and Baylands Athletic Center. Long term, there'll be hopefully more parks coming online as the recycled water line gets extended. Don't really have a lot of information on that right now, but I hope to have more for you soon.
The idea is to extend it all the way down Middlefield to South Palo Alto. In fact, the new Mitchell Park Community Center is all plumbed to accept recycled water already. The line to be installed. Accelerating that work seems to be would be a good strategy, because that's money spent now for the current drought, but it's ongoing.
So long-term, that recycled water, does it hurt the plants, or does it have any impact to them?
I think it's site-by-site analysis, and it really depends on the soil profile. So we look at a park like Greer, where it's been irrigated with recycled water for some time, and I hear mixed opinions on whether it impacts certain trees differently, less salt tolerant because the recycled water has a little higher salt content. Ours is getting better and better, and by ours I mean our city provided recycled water has dropped its TDS, or total dissolved solids, significantly in the last couple of years, and it's getting closer and closer to the point where we feel that turf and plants can almost take 100% recycled water and do okay. So we've pushed the limits periodically, both at the golf course and at the Baylands, and ran it for periods of time at 100%. And at the golf course, eventually we see accumulation of salts rising up and it starts to stress and kill grass. But that's that particular site. So I don't know that that transfers to every other site necessarily.
It's also the closest to the bay.
That's right, that's right. With a very shallow water table right there with salt water.
What's the expectation as to when, as a city, we'll be at the 24% reduction with regard to like a date, timeline?
I believe we're going to be required to start the process June 1st, is my understanding.
Have you noticed in the preserves where we don't irrigate just the native plantings and trees, have you guys started to notice?
We do. We've got indicator species like buckeye trees, for example, that will turn the quickest during drought years. This isn't too new because these are all unirrigated areas. So in the past, we'll see those indicator trees that turn the fastest, like the buckeye, and others will dry out a little faster. And it'll probably have implications for us for an extended fire season, wildland fire season. Luckily, we've made good strides with our wildland fire protection plan and made some improvements that protect us there. But yeah, still, my expectation is that we'll have definitely drier habitat.
What sort of guiding principles are you using when you decide which parks to cut back on or not?
That's an excellent question, and we've been kind of on the gun to move quickly because the turnaround, the amount of parks to go through, every single one of those we had to pour through and say, well, is this on a continuous irrigation zone or valve where I could turn all this in one shot, or do we have to reconfigure things? So it was a lot of analysis in every park, and we followed the basic criteria of, is it a heavily brokered or used piece of turf? And I'll give you an example. The area I showed you was the Baylands Athletic Center, where we had athletic field, and it was highly used, it was highly brokered. And so we selected that as a criteria that we continue to water a little bit more, and we used the aesthetic ornamental turf as the areas where we'd say either let go, or did it lend itself to be isolated and could be isolated, removed kind of easily. Did it have trees on it that I have to do something different with? Because if I leave your irrigation system off for a very long time, the cost of getting it back running again is kind of expensive. So we're trying to be judicious and intelligent as we kind of select these areas. But the main criteria is it ornamental and aesthetic? Then we have flexibility of eliminating or reducing. And is it highly brokered? And is there a safety component to it, like an athletic field or a highly brokered area? For example, the internal courtyard, the Lucy Stern, where we have weddings, and a lot of the special events or rentals are predicated on having an internal courtyard with this grass to recreate and use. It's almost part of the rental in many ways. So there are a few areas like that. But basically, is it highly used? Is it highly brokered? Usually lent itself to, in our criteria, extending the irrigation to a little more water use.
And so you're not using a criterion that has to do with like amount of resource and dollars that are lost through death of items. I'm just
Death of turf, you mean?
Yeah, well, death of trees, plants.
Well, we're not going to let the trees go. So we haven't identified any
So you've
area.
already established that you will not let trees die? Okay.
That was one of our criteria, yes, for
Criteria.
treed areas. And this was the good example, that in the turf area that did have trees, we changed it to a different kind of color, that orange color you saw, which said 2 times per month.
And so you're going to present on this on May 11th?
I won't, the utilities department will be bringing a staff report to the council.
And then is that the same report you're going to give back to us on? I'm just wondering how we coordinate with council. Often on a topic like this, we would hear it before it goes to council, then they might want to look at our feedback.
Yeah.
So this seems a little backwards to me.
But I think that May 11th won't be getting to the degree of detail that you see here. So this is very much draft. Council won't be seeing this. This is just kind of a staff document to let us know, can we or will, where are we at in our capability to reach a 24% reduction? Because it's such we're such a big water user, I can't just arbitrarily say, well, if I think I can get rid of most of my aesthetic turf and meet that 24%. I need to be reassured because the penalties are stiff and the need to meet it is huge. And I believe we're one of the dominant water users. So it's incumbent upon us to be confident of whatever percent we're saying we're going to meet, that we can meet it. And I think this is the only way I know how.
So from a percentage perspective, of the 24%, you may not know, and this might just be way into the weed question, what percentage of the 24% do you think Park and Rec will have to reduce versus other city agencies?
Yeah, we don't.
It's what we've been, and that data is still being analyzed.
Because I would imagine hard for Darren to go
It's
through
very
this exercise. It's almost impossible.
I mean, and this
Yeah.
is a lot of sites too, and the
Yeah.
amount of work that Darren and staff have done so far, and recognize that it's changing. There may
Right.
be additional executive orders from the governor and other things that put further restrictions on them. Actually, we expect that in the next couple of months, so there's going to have to be even more work. But your point is that 24% is the goal, right, for our city, but our parks division and our park system is going to have to take a greater load, carry a heavier load than, we've heard as much as 35%, that actually we're going to have to be able to do, because some of the buildings and indoor use, there's only so much you can do, the ability to get to 24, 25%.
So of that 24% though, is that any of that being kicked to the residents, like with the?
Yeah, that's the whole city has to
Right.
come up with 24%
So-
total.
When the city's going through this
City-
exercise,
the
sorry.
City community. not
So
just the
they're
city
gonna
organization.
come in for the residents and say, this is now that, I went for a walk the other day, gorgeous rose gardens and beautiful green luscious lawns. And I wanted to knock on the door and like bop the homeowner on the head. No, I mean, like, hello, beautiful garden, but you know, what's going on here, people? Because the cost of the city has to be spread through everyone, resident as well as city, commercial and commercial people. So that's why Darren's going through this horrific exercise of what can I let die? As Deirdre just said, what death are we allowing to happen without residents taking some
I
responsibility?
think everyone in the community, residents, businesses, public, we all have to take.
So this is going to be an edict from,
Yeah.
Well, who's leading the public education on this? Who's in
That's
charge
right,
of
the
that?
It's our utilities department. Yeah.
Yes?
they
So
haven't
that
done a
May
very
11th
good job in a couple of
If you're
areas.
interested in this topic, the May 11th meeting will be an important one you'll hear. And the staff report itself will be an interesting read. I'm sure you will get it.
Yeah.
Jen?
I just have a quick question. The water feature at Mitchell Park, is that recirculating?
It is not.
That will be turned off.
It will be turned off.
What was the time span it took before grass and trees were damaged by recycled water, by 100% recycled?
It depended on the site, and at the golf course, I couldn't give you a really accurate estimation. We ran it for probably like a month on 100% recycled.
We can't make it to rainy season, so we couldn't just go over all summer and
No.
do 100%.
Well, it's interesting you ask me because the new golf course should we get underway here one day. We have a turf variety that can withstand 100% recycled water, as Palo.
Have you ever seen that?
You know, Joe Belair did a lot of research, superintendents there retiring on that.
I have an educational point to make. I think it was last weekend I went on a native gardens tour in Los Altos. It was very educational, inspirational to try to make those kinds of changes within our own, property. Do you know if someone's running that in the city of Palo Alto?
We do. Do you mean conversion of lawn to?
Where people put their gardens on display for educational
Oh, yeah,
purposes?
yeah.
Do we have an annual tour in the city of Palo
I don't know
Alto?
if there's a tour. I know there's some of those gardens.
Right.
Yeah, we can bring it up. And
Because I know they do one in Los Altos, and that's the one I normally go to, so I haven't seen it noticed in the city of Palo Alto.
Yeah. Gamble Gardens is kind of our go-to, and I know they're heavily involved in that.
I mean, we're residents.
I know,
right?
they kind of are part of that tour of resident gardens.
I would like to preface that the renovation of a turf area to native landscape does not mean in the first 2 years that you save water. In fact, you would probably use more water to establish that plant material. The plant material is based on drought tolerance because of the size of the root system that grows. And to develop that root system takes water to do. So it's not like an area where you can just convert your grass to native landscape and you're just reducing water. It's a transitional type of an idea, so that part probably needs to be provided in the education as well to residents of, what that conversion is and what actually the amount of water you can expect to use, because in that process, when people do renovate their yards to drought tolerant, they are quite surprised in the first year that they actually probably using a little bit more water than they were, because they were watering established plant material, even if it was grass. Because most old grass is not actually a lot of grass anymore, but it's a mixture of weeds that are usually a lot tougher than just a monoculture of the grass that we have. So just another point of view to think about.
Thank you, glad you mentioned that, because that's another criteria that we're looking through as we do this exercise, is that particularly for those high demand athletic fields, if we let them die, the cost of bringing them back in terms of money and water.
That's kind of what I was getting at.
Yeah, to reseed a field, you could end up using more water to bring it back than it would to cut down to 3 days a week or whatever we can do to keep it alive.
So that would be in your criteria, right? The cost to reestablish what you kill.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
No, it's the compliance.
Okay. Next on the agenda is any ad hoc updates. Are there any ad hoc committees that want to report in? Okay.
I have an update that I did notice when I read the minutes that one of the things we talked about at the retreat was putting together a resolution for council about fire management budgeting. So I just wanted to put that back on the radar.
Yes, thank you.
I was going to raise that in the context of the agenda for next month.
Agenda's going, okay, we'll put that on the agenda for next month. Okay, so that moves on to comments and announcements. Rob, do you have anything?
Well, the Mayfair Parade is this Saturday, the 93rd. Parade, the theme is No Space to Alienate. She said. Yeah. Well, the mayor, last year's mayor, said, the theme is to be about anti-bullying. I'm thinking, how do we make that fun? But it's what we try and do is have a topic that is fun and interesting, but also is something that teachers in elementary schools in particular, as they build their floats, can have a conversation about something that relates to youth development and that type of thing. So no space to alienate, it's also space focus, but also that you're not alienating your friends and so on. That kind of thing. So really fun. And so it's this Saturday, 10 o'clock, the parade starts, fair at the Heritage Park. Afterwards it runs into the afternoon, lots of music. It's going to be great. It's one of the best events we do, and kids can participate. Like most children participate already in one way or another as part of their school group or whatever, but if a child wants to participate because they just want to walk in the parade, they can. We have kids with pets. Just come, bring your pet, on the leash, or kids on wheels, come, and we'll get you into the parade. So yeah, really going to be a fun event. I think we have 78 groups in the parade. And in fact, this year, Mayor Holman's very interested in the parade and has been supporting some of the planning and stuff. So she's been meeting with us, which has been great. But her recommendation was to extend the parade route, one of the things, so we did that so we can go up off Litton Gardens and Channing House.
Yes.
And so we've created, yeah, it's, why we shortened it partly was because it was so long and the parade was going, but there was no one on the sides to watch the parade. In case we want to encourage.
Channing House always had a lot of people, right?
Yeah, they did. So what we're doing, we're having actually a block party, but we're organizing for them and with them, right in front of Channing House and Litton Gardens, and Avenidas is participating in Stephen's House, and so that's a nice addition. It should be really fun. If you're participating, you'll be there.
What time is it start?
10 o'clock. This is when the parade gets started. The fair at Heritage Park starts at the same time, so you can go there as well. And wait.
The commission's marking there?
Yeah, I'll be there at corner of University and Emerson.
Do we ever invite the other commissions? Because I don't really see too many of you.
Well, usually we get some human relations commissioners.
There's one or two.
Yeah.
It's got a showing from Park and Rec. Commissions, yeah.
The other thing I want to say is that we're going through the budget season right now, so getting our budget goes through the hearing process, which is through the Finance Committee. Eric, are you on the Finance Committee? I can't remember. You are. Okay. So there's 4 council members on the Finance Committee. I think is it Vice Mayor Schmidt is the chair. Is that correct? And so this community services budget goes to the Finance Committee on May 5th. And what happens there is that they meet several times this month and take 2 or 3 departments at a time and look through the budget for fiscal year 16 and the requests that have been asked and the rationale for those requests and a good discussion. And they have the opportunity then to recommend changes and tweaks to that budget. And then after May, it goes to the full council for adoption. So the next Tuesday, May 5th, is when the community services budget comes forward. So, do you want to add anything? The council got their taste last night where Jim Keane, our city manager, gave an initial sort of preview of the capital budget plus the operating budget for the council. Of course, it's a lot of information, and they only spoke for maybe half an hour or 40 minutes, and then the books were handed out. And they're enormous.
You know, other than 3 of us are real green eye shade guys, so watch out or something.
Yeah.
You pretty much through the book already after last night?
Sorry?
Did you get through the book yet?
I got through it by 11 o'clock.
Oh.
Yeah.
I believe them.
It's like 2 or 3 of these things.
Yeah, just a lot of.
No, I'd also like to add that Rob was to be presented the key to the Magical Bridge 2 weekends ago that opened up the playground. So if you haven't been by it to see the playground, it's really it's a lot more powerful than I thought it was going to be.
So you designed it?
Yeah.
Yeah, Peter Benson here, our landscape architect, deserves a lot of credit, as well as the members of the public that made that happen. Lincoln and team, the city. Donated some land, of course, and some seed money, $300,000, I think, in the end result, that really was put forward, and then they raised $4 million. And they never came back to ask for more money, which is amazing. And so several of you saw you at the event, the opening. What a remarkable playground it is.
It was astonishing. I agree with Peter that the design is just even better than, we've been on that for years, looking at the design.
Yeah.
And how it evolved, and it's just phenomenal and completely heartwarming. Everywhere you look at that place, it's just absolutely terrific.
And one of the goals of the founders of the Magical Bridge Playground is to start a conversation, a national conversation about inclusive play, and not just with playground, but generally. And I think they're really doing that. This is a national story, this playground. That's quite something.
It did get national publicity.
It did.
Can you plan to report back to the Parks and Rec Commission in a year or so about the durability of the components? Because that will come into play when people want to integrate those into other parks. It'll be really important to hear what lasted, what had trouble, that kind of thing. Is that kind of already in your plans?
Not right now to come back to give an update, but we definitely are. I mean, we observe the base of the playground every day to make sure that it's holding up. And I'm happy to say that it's doing very, very well for the amount of traffic that it's getting. So,
It's a magnet, yeah.
Okay. For agenda.
I just want, I was gonna ask this month anyway about any news on the golf course. With or without water impacts either way. Is it just still in advance, or are we looking at plan B, or?
Plan. There isn't a lot of new information, really. At this point, we're not going to be able to start construction before the end of the calendar year. The earliest we would see permits at this point would be after summer or at the very end of summer, and then it just wouldn't be a good, sensible time to start the construction. So the earliest is January, February time period. So the real question is, well, how are we doing with the permit application process? There's constantly movement in the right direction. It's just agonizingly slow. And from the golf course perspective, we are really waiting for the levee project to get through their issues with the Army Corps and with the Marine Fisheries and the Water Board. And what we hear, we need a permit from all those groups too, but what they're telling us is, wait. We want to first be sure that we're satisfied with the levee project, and then we do the permit for the golf course. And so you can see the issue there. If there's concerns about the levee project, that they think in some way that project's going to change, that may impact them what's designed for the golf course, and that's why they don't want to do that. But the Joint Powers Authority is making progress. They've made significant progress with the Water Board, have their permit from them. They're now working with the Army Corps and Marine Fisheries, and I understand that's going well. They've made progress, but not a permit in hand at this point.
Okay, thanks.
I just have one quick question. So on the schedule, the City Council Commission joint meeting on the 27th of next month,
Yes.
it says 9 to 10 p.m., but then like 75 emails came in like 9 to 10, no, 8 to 9. So what time is it?
So agenda planning is next on the agenda. So
Okay,
all
all right.
We'll get to that. Okay, so it's agenda planning, we'll save that for the end. We have this resolution on fire mitigation for Foothills Park. Bixby Park, the PIO may come back. We were thinking about having it this month, but Darren's been swamped with other work, as you can see, so that will get bumped to next month. We have a couple ad hocs that we had penciled in, the website and community gardens. So you have a couple weeks to figure out whether there's anything that you want to present if you're on those ad hocs. Then the joint study session for the council. Want to talk about that?
So I'm not sure if everyone's responded to Catherine on availability for that evening, but the council has a lot on their agenda over the next few months, and so the idea here was to pool some of these study sessions on a separate night so that they can get through them, and that's why that's happening. And the 27th was identified as a night for this commission as well as the Public Art Commission, the Palo Youth Council, all three of them, one after the other. The latest count I thought was that we may not have enough commissions. I think 2 or 3 said they couldn't attend, and I was talking to Catherine about that, and my view is if 3 can't attend the study session, we shouldn't do it. We should try and find another time where more commissioners can be there. And if it's later in the year, I think it's probably fine, unless the commission thinks that,
I think it's much preferable to have it much later in the year. I don't think we have much to report to them, frankly.
On top of which, we would have to plan it in the next 30 minutes.
Keith and I talked to that, gives some
Yeah,
idea.
I kind of feel like we just did it.
Well, I mean,
I know.
It comes a few hours after our next meeting, so we would have to plan it right now for what the topics are going to be.
Right.
And if you look at the last 6 months, the bulk of our time has been on the master plan, and that still is kind of a work in progress. We certainly couldn't give an update on where we stand, but I don't know.
Can't we just send them a memo? Send them the matrix, this is what we're working on. Eric likes it.
So
Does
it's not
anyone have any-
it's not a big problem from the council's perspective. I think just, pushing it a few months later would be highly preferable for us.
After the summer break.
Yeah, that's kind of my sense. I don't know if Councilman Phillips, if you have any thoughts, or you're pretty new to this, so.
I think, do it when it makes sense to me, don't try to rush it. Squeeze, we got a time slot here, and we got lots of stuff to do, you guys got lots of stuff to do. Do it when there's useful material.
Makes a lot of sense. So that's what we'll report back to.
Yeah, Beth was okay with
Okay,
that.
good. That's what we'll do then. Good.
Oh, back on, this should have been back at the comments. Scott Park, we started construction on that?
Oh, yeah, it's under construction.
It's level.
It's level, and a washable court going in, and
Yeah, I really want the bocce. And how about,
It doesn't take water, Bachi. So-
Yeah, it's true.
Water bocce.
No, it doesn't take water.
I
it's,
thought you just invented a new sport.
El Camino Park is underway. It's still currently on schedule, but it does represent another policy question that Darren Lee. The northern field is a synthetic turf field, so that's fine. But the southern field, large field, is a turf field. And it's going to require a lot of water to grow that in. I think we're planning to use sod, but still it's going to be a lot of water to make sure that turf is ready for play. It's another question that will come up as a policy matter, I think, for our community, with the council, not just for our community park, but all of our parks, our renovation plans, and do we need to rethink some of the decisions about how we bring them online. So we don't have a recommendation about that. But
That one field is literally sitting on top of 3 million gallons of water. Can't we tap some of that here?
would we consider
It's a
going
valid question.
artificial turf or doing just a dirt outfield?
Dirt outfield?
Oh,
I know.
no plan on
I think what the main,
If you're an infielder, you dive on dirt all the time.
That's why I play outfield.
Exactly.
I think what we need to do, for every park site, as discussed with Darren, is really think critically about everyone and have a good sense of the criteria that we're using and some consistency about using that criteria. And some of them are unique, like bringing on a new field like that that's really large, it's a couple acres. That's a lot of water to grow that in, to at least pause and think through whether, does this make sense given what we're facing with regard to the drought.
How about if we open half of it? The artificial turf gets open, they're playing it.
A number of different ways we could approach it.
Yeah.
So that's what we were doing that with every site.
And what time frame do we have to make a decision on that baseball field?
Probably, we'd be ready to lay turf there at the end of summer.
So it's
pretty
like 7
soon.
months.
Yeah, our hope is to open that field by the end of the calendar year. Both of those fields. And of course, the community's been waiting for those fields to come online for a couple of years now because we've fallen behind on that one, which is just another factor to consider. Like one might say, well, you haven't had it for so long. Well, maybe not bringing it online is the smart thing to do because it saves water. On the other hand, the community hasn't had that field, and it's going to be a great park, as you know. You spend a lot of time on it. It's fantastic. Really, really nice park. Community wants to use it. They want to have access to it. So some of those tough policy decisions I expect the commission will have to weigh in on, and ultimately council.
Okay, is that it?
Okay.
Just on this resolution, I did want to check, Eric, to see if we're still in okay shape on timing, because this is the resolution around the fire, that was a CIP now going into the annual budget, and we wanted to just get finance committee support. If this is far along, then we might have missed the deadline.
I don't have a good answer for that one. I think the schedule for what's going in front of the finance committee is being set by the staff, not by the finance committee, so you gotta check on those guys.
Okay.
So whatever their deadline, they have stuff in there.
Yeah, it's in the fire management plan, moved from the CIP capital budget to the operating budget. The operating budget is being looked at by the finance committee next week, Tuesday, and it includes the fire management plan, which is in 3 different departments, though. Community services is a piece of it. So will be discussed next week. The way to communicate interest there, one, Councilmember Philsett is on this committee, so we can relay the strong interest of this commission on that particular line item to the extent that you understand it. So that's one way, or you can have Commissioner come and speak. It's a public meeting, and there'll be time to speak, and the commission unanimously supports that particular recommendation.
The third item is just even after it gets out of the committee, we can also still do a resolution as opposed to council.
You can, and typically that is the way. I mean, the commission really is advisory to the city council as a whole, not advisory to the finance committee or the policy. So that's probably more appropriate.
So that sounds like we can leave it on the agenda for next month. Keith?
Yeah.
And then, you can be our
Yeah,
liaison.
you can certainly, I mean, I'd encourage you to show up to the finance committee sessions. I hope a public session, there's time for public comment and speak with them. The one thing I would say is that, I've been through this personally before, so I'm going to find out how it works the same as you guys are. I expect that probably the council isn't going to make too many changes to what comes from the finance committee. I think, so, for what that's worth. Okay.
Any other comments? We have a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.